new international companies. Sweden lagged behind to the extent that we went from being the third richest country on the planet to the 13th richest country on the planet.
13th isn't bad, doesn't sound like a crisis.
But it makes it difficult to fund all these policies that Sweden had. So they started to print money. So we had a debt and inflation-fueled boom that ended in a terrible crisis. And to defend the Swedish currency, the central bank even had interest rates at 500% for a while.
What made it a crisis?
Well, suddenly all those systems that people depended on, the pension system, healthcare and so on, didn't get the funding they needed. So there were waiting lines to get healthcare. People couldn't get the pension that they thought that they depended on for the future. So everybody suddenly realized that something else has to be done.
And even the socialist-leaning politicians agreed?
The socialist minister of finance in Sweden said that our policies have been unsustainable, sometimes absurd, and the tax system is perverse. So even they wanted to dismantle the big government that they had built.
So what happened?
Well, early 1990s, we had a wide agreement from the left to the right that we have to reform the economy, open up new markets, liberalize product markets so businesses could start in new areas, do away with occupational licenses and things like that, lower taxes, reform the pension system so that it wasn't unsustainable, partly privatize the pension system.
Privatize the pension system? That terrifies people.
Yeah, it does.
It means you're not guaranteed money from the government.
Exactly. It's only a defined contribution. You don't know what you will get. And obviously that scares people who wanted a lot. But when they realized that the alternative was that the whole pension system would collapse, they thought that this is much better than nothing.
But Sweden is still cited as the socialist paradise.
When you look at our policies, we do have a bigger welfare state than the US, higher taxes than the US, but in other areas, when it comes to free markets, when it comes to competition, when it comes to free trade, Sweden is actually more free market. If you look at the latest statistics from the Heritage Foundation and Wall Street Journal, Sweden is apparently more free market than the United States.
There's no minimum wage. Government doesn't control production.
Yeah, and we've also tried to open up the welfare state to private providers because we've realized that we've got problems with a nationalized healthcare system, so we need to, well, privatize one of the biggest hospitals in Stockholm and open up to other private companies. And in the education system, because it didn't work. It didn't work very well, so we needed competition, innovation, new ideas. So we rolled out a national school voucher system so that private schools got the same funding as the public ones.
On The View.
Name one country that socialism has ever worked, and also
First of all, socialism means the government owning the means of production. Sweden has never had that. The socialists realized in Sweden that they need big business. They need multinational companies to fund the welfare state. So it was always a free market to that extent, and the big businesses, even got specific benefits and privileges because the economy was so dependent on them.
Jim Carrey.
I grew up in Canada, okay? We have socialized medicine. And I'm here to tell you that this bullshit line that you get on all of the political shows from people is that it's a failure. The system is a failure in Canada. It is not a failure in Canada. I never waited for anything in my life. I chose my own doctors. My mother never paid for a prescription. It was fantastic.
He must have been lucky, and that's great. But in the recent Swedish election, the top priority for voters in the polls was not crime or immigration or the economy, it was healthcare and the fact that people had to wait in line for treatment for such a long time. Specifically when it comes to cancer treatment, for certain types of cancer, you have to wait for more than 200 days to get treatment. And that tells you something about the problem of rationing healthcare by just not giving people what they need.
They got a booming economy that is growing at twice the rate of the American economy. They got surpluses, they got more people working, and they have a society that works.
Well, everybody has to work in Sweden to fund the welfare state because it's so large. So we really have to do hard work to get people into jobs. But the way we do that is by opening up more markets, having fewer license requirements, occupational licenses, the kind of things that America has to stop people from entering new jobs. And so in a way, we'll have a successful economy, but that's partly because we're free market to some extent.
From your movie.
It is a socialist economy.
Volvos and
socialized medicine.
All those stereotypes are quite interesting, and many of them are stuck in the past. Volvo is now a Chinese company.
What does that mean from a classical liberal point of view?
Well, it means that for a while, the Swedish economy was doing so bad and the currency was going south. So everything was quite cheap, so the Chinese and others could buy our big companies. And that was incredibly problematic at that time for the reason that not that they were bought by someone else, it's in a way a sign of strength that they want to invest in our economy. But it's a problem if we don't grow the new companies like that. In around the turn of the millennium, we didn't have one company among the 50 biggest that had been created over the last 25 years. So they were all created during the sort of small government laissez-faire era. But after the reforms, suddenly we reformed the economy, opened up new markets, and then suddenly we got the new companies in telecoms, in tech, and so on.
And is this just Sweden, or is this also true for Denmark, Norway? Well, Norway's got oil money.
Yeah, Norway is also a strange exception because they have all that oil. So unless American socialists have the plan to strike oil everywhere, that's not a relevant example.
But Denmark shrank its government too?
Yes.
Finland?
Scandinavians.
Iceland?
Yeah.
Astrid Lindgren, 102% in taxes. How is this even possible?
Yeah, 102% tax is too much even for the socialists.
But how can it be more than 100%?
Yeah, it's quite absurd. She was this famous author of children's books like Pippi Longstocking and so on, and a long-time social democrat. She found out that when she sold another book, she ended up with a marginal tax rate. She ended up in a higher threshold that increased the taxes totally, so that she had to pay for selling more books. And she wrote this angry essay about a witch who was quite mean and vicious, but not at all as vicious as the Swedish tax authorities.
How can you have a more than 100% tax bill?
Yeah, well, no one got that math. And actually, the Swedish socialist finance minister at that time said, no, she's wrong. She's bad at math. But actually, he was the one who was wrong. The Swedish tax system at that time was so perverse and strange that the Swedish population just said, enough, we can't do this. And even the socialists said, this is perverse, we can't do this.
So for every extra dollar she earned, she'd owe $1.02?
That was too much, even for the socialists.
We have some very interesting reforms on letting private enterprises into welfare, schools, hospitals, healthcare, elderly care, that have worked out quite well.
Private enterprise runs schools, hospitals?
Yeah. Because we realized in Sweden that with these government monopolies, nothing happens. We don't get the innovation that we get when we have competition in other areas. So the way to create competition was to allow private businesses to start new schools with new ideas, with new teaching models, and then allow families to pick a school themselves, which forces schools to become better. And one of the results that we've seen is not just that the private schools are better than the public ones, but even the public schools in the vicinity of private schools, they often improve because they have to get then pupils and the funding that comes with them.
To compete.
You see that everywhere else in the economy. If you're forced to compete, you have to step up, you have to be better. Why not in the welfare services?
Today, the healthcare system is not primarily run by the national government?
No, we don't have a sort of single payer system and the kind of thing that American socialists think we do in Sweden. This is based on the regional level in Sweden, and therefore also funded by local taxes primarily, which is a flat tax. And then the national government steps in and has some extra funding for specific things that they want to do. But this is primarily a regional issue.
But government run?
Yes. Government run, but quite often private businesses in this sector, funded by government money. What
can America learn from Sweden?
Well, you can learn both from the good and from the bad. The bad experiences we've had and others should learn from is don't get cocky. I mean, even though the economy might work very well, you have all this money, you're on top of the world, you can't turn your backs to the well. to the creation of wealth. That's what we did in the 1970s and 1980s, and just started to redistribute and make strange policy decisions that ran counter to any kind of economic orthodoxy. And that almost killed the Swedish economy. It almost ruined us completely. So you have to continue to create wealth in order to use it. The good thing to be learned from Sweden is how you reform the economy. I think it's important for the US and to learn from how you can introduce competition and choice in government services like education, for example. If you want a better future for our kids, you can learn how to reform those systems that we all rely on, the pension system, social security, things that are unsustainable with the kind of demographic future we have, unless we change this into more of defined contribution rather than defined benefits.
Low-income earners in Sweden pay a lot more than low-income earners in America. So despite the fact that Sweden looks like sort of a socialist country which taxes the rich exorbitantly high, the truth is the opposite.
Really?
This is the dirty little secret about the Swedish tax system. We don't take from the rich and give to the poor. We squeeze the poor because they are loyal taxpayers. They don't move to Monaco and they don't dodge, they don't have tax lawyers. So we have most of our income tax come from a flat regional tax at around 30%, even on the poor, even on the middle class. And then we also have a system of VAT, a consumption tax at 25%, where the poor pay exactly the same amount as the rich do. So all of
And it's quite a bit. It's about 50 to 60% once you're earning $37,000.
But it's interesting that the Swedish tax system is less progressive than the American. If you look at the whole situation in the US, the 10% of the richest households, they pay around 45% of all the income taxes. In Sweden, they only pay 27%. And the reason is that Swedish socialists realized you can have a big government, or you can force the rich to pay for it all. You have to pick one. You can't do both. Because if the rich and the big businesses leave the country, then we have nothing.
All these celebrities and politicians say Sweden is socialist, a socialist success.
Well, Sweden is not socialist because the government doesn't own the means of production. To see that, you have to go to Venezuela or to Cuba or North Korea. But we did have a period in the 1970s and 1980s when we had something that resembled socialism, a big government that taxed and spent heavily. And that's the period in Swedish history when our economy was going south dramatically. And even socialists nowadays say that was awful. That was a terrible failure that almost killed our economy.
Unfortunately, today, most socialists still don't accept the lessons of history, that real socialism has failed everywhere it's been tried. But we who understand the benefits of free and competitive markets shouldn't just point out socialism's problems. We ought to make the case for why capitalism works. So I was happy that Norberg has written this new book, The Capitalist Manifesto. The subtitle says, "The global free market will save the world." That's pretty grandiose.
But it is saving the world. Bit by bit, step by step, every day. Every day over the past 20 years, more than 130,000 people were lifted out of extreme poverty. Every day for 20 years. And it happened in societies that began to open up their economies and integrate into trade and global investments. And that's what capitalism does. That's not just a fancy theory. It's something real that is happening. And it's also something that we should keep in mind every time somebody talks about how we should have more tariffs and protectionism and regulations, that every kind of intervention like that limits what human beings can do with their lives. And that hurts opportunity and it increases poverty, and we have to save the world from such interventions.
Elon Musk recommended your book on Twitter, and that's gotten millions of views. Congratulations. But he says especially Chapter 4. So I look at Chapter 4, it's titled In Defense of the 1%. So he only likes it because you're defending rich people like him.
The question is, how did he get rich? How does someone get rich? That's more interesting than how much money they've got. In every society, we have people who control resources. If they take them from somebody else, that's bad. We should stop that. But in a capitalist society, you get rich by enriching others. by producing electric cars, for example, or new technological capabilities and making them come down in price and making sure that more people have access to them. In that case, if they get rich because we hand over our money because we think those goods and services are more valuable to us, then it's a great thing that they are rich, because they got rich by helping us. The Nobel laureate William Nordhaus, he made a back-of-the-envelope calculation of how much does rich entrepreneurs who introduce new technologies and goods and services in the economy capture of the value that they create. And he came up with the conclusion that they get to keep some 2% of the value that they create. Which means that the rest of us who just laid on the couch and watched Netflix, we got 98% because we got increased purchasing power.
Musk's got billions of dollars. He only kept 2% of each transaction?
The greatest value of new goods and services and technologies does not come in the dollars and cents that we hand over to the producer. It comes in how they enrich our lives, how we use these goods, and how they keep coming down in price and become much more accessible to more people. Constantly making sure that what was luxury goods a couple of decades ago are suddenly something that most of us can afford. One of the most astonishing statistics about the US is that people who fall below the poverty line in the US now has a greater chance of owning amenities like refrigerators, air conditioners, washing machines, dishwashers, dryers, and of course cell phones and computers than the average American did in 1970. That's the greatest voluntary, spontaneous redistribution of resources that exists. The fact that all those luxury goods are down in price and are suddenly accessible to most people.
The headline, the mass loneliness crisis.
Loneliness is an epidemic.
We are absolutely in a loneliness crisis.
Nothing to back it up?
Well, yes, there is an epidemic of headlines saying that there is a loneliness epidemic, but there's no empirical data that actually shows that we feel more lonely now than we did in the past. This is often based on just looking at different generations and notices that, yes, the youngest feel like they're more lonely than the rest of us. But the question is, are they more lonely than we were when we were young? And so you have to compare life with life. So young today compared with young back then, old today compared to old back then. And then there is no such increase in loneliness, which is interesting because I would also think that it's less of a stigma to tell people that you feel lonely nowadays than it was in the 1950s or 70s.
But more people live alone now. I would think that would make more people lonelier.
That's correct. More people live alone, and there are also instances of people spending less time surrounded by other people. But the interesting thing, and this is what they never tell you in the reports, in the media, is that people who live alone and spend less time surrounded by other people are also more happy with those relationships. So it seems to be something interesting that happens when you choose your own relationships, when you choose your own partners, colleagues, and friends to associate with. It's not necessarily a better world, a more harmonious relationship when you're forced into traditional overcrowding or forced to spend time with people because there are no options.
And yet these capitalist media force. Capitalism keeps people isolated because of support for personal gain.
But this talk about how we're all getting lonelier in capitalist societies. But the question is, if this was the result of capitalism, then surely we would have more loneliness in capitalist free market societies. But every survey, every poll we're looking at shows that people say that they're less lonely in the most market-oriented society. There is even a human freedom index produced by Fraser and Cato Institute, which measures how free a society is, how economically free. It is. And it tells you that on this 10-point scale, if you increase freedom by 1 point, you reduce loneliness levels by 6 percentage points, according to what people tell the pollster. And that's interesting because there's no such correlation when it comes to what the left and the right talks about, that they want a more equal society or a more religious society. There's no correlation between religion and equality and loneliness. So actually, we need more capitalism and more personal freedom to compensate for the loneliness that apparently equality and religion produces.
In your book, you cite a survey which basically says this, which is surprising. They ask people, do you have someone you can count on in times of trouble? And it turns out in America and other capitalist countries, very few people say that. But in places like India and China, where I would think they'd have big families to count on, many more say they have no one.
Yeah, it's the complete opposite of what people expect. They think that in traditional societies with enforced communities and collective policies, people would say that they have more people to trust on, more friends and more loyalty. But it's the complete opposite. It seems like in traditional and less market-based societies, between 20 to 30 to 40% say they have no one to count on if they need help. Whereas in the richest and most individualist societies, it's in the low single digits. And it tells you, I think, that enforced community doesn't really create community and solidarity. We have that in our past as well. Overcrowding and enforced relationships, that's not necessarily something that creates solidarity. Once upon a time, the most frequent crime, the most frequent violent crime was children being violent to their parents. It seems like there's something in these voluntary relationships in modern market-oriented societies that creates more decent relationships.
The material incentives of capitalists isolate us from nature, each other, and ourselves. It's a miracle we aren't even lonelier.
One of the huge sources of loneliness is capitalism.
I understand why those charlatans get an audience, because, yeah, at times we all feel lonely and life and relationships are hard, but do people think that any other non-market society has less of greed? Do they think that the Venezuelan oligarchs or Putin's friends or the Iranian Revolutionary Guard have less interest in personal gain? I think that North Korea is the place where the leaders are most interested in Rolex watches and limousines and fancy cognac, but it's the world's least market-based society. So everybody is into some sort of gain, but how do they get it? Well, in market-based societies, we only enrich ourselves by enriching others, by coming up with work, goods, services, technologies, opportunities that others are willing to pay for. So it's actually a way of caring for other people, taking their interests and their demand into consideration. Whereas in Russia and Venezuela, they get that personal gain by taking from others.
I believe that socialism is the only way forward for humanity. It is moral. It is just. At this point, it's just common sense. With the boot of capitalism off your neck, you will be more able to enjoy freedom in every sense of the word.
This is the traditional way of comparing the everyday existing capitalism with all its flaws with this dream of how socialism would work in the best circumstances. But when you look at real existing socialism, it doesn't just produce poverty and breadlines. It produces much worse human relationship because it's a top-down system. It's a system where all the resources are distributed from the top, command and control, and what they get, you don't get. So it's a zero-sum game, and we can see that in polls. Countries that have lived through communism, they express much less subjective well-being, much less trust in human relationships, because they are the places where you have to exploit every meeting to get the resources you need, not in capitalism.
Capitalist values of ruthless greed and competition.
Under capitalism, people compete. Sounds divisive. Sounds like it would pull us apart.
It sounds divisive because we use that language about competition. But I would say that the most important aspect of capitalism is cooperation, voluntary cooperation. The fact that you constantly associate with, work with and do transactions with other people on a voluntary basis. And that's why you constantly hear every time you buy something this double thank you. You say thank you, and in the grocery they thank you.
Yeah, it's weird. You both say thank you. You both feel you want.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's strange. I'm brought up with the idea that I should say thank you when someone has done me a service. But in the market economy, we do each other services constantly. That's how we get richer. No deal ever happens unless both parties think that they benefit more from doing that than not doing it. And that's brand new innovation in human history. All traditional ways of organizing an economy, slavery, feudalism, communism, fascism, that's all based on getting resources by taking them from somebody else. That's divisive. What capitalism does is that it forces us to think about, what do the other guy want? What are strangers interested in? And then trying to find a way to help them, because that helps us.
You argue capitalism makes us generous?
It sounds surprising, and this surprised the researchers as well. For many years, lots of researchers around the world have been looking at how generous are people when they're playing different economic games in a kind of social experiment.
There are many real-life tests of that. This YouTube channel demonstrated a common experiment. Here the host gives people $20.
You're not allowed to communicate what you're thinking, talk about the decision you're making until you make it.
You can divide this between yourself and a stranger in any way you like, but the only condition is the other person has to accept the offer.
If he refuses it,
then you get nothing.
Then I get nothing.
Then nobody gets anything.
Then it's game over. So you have to offer something to the other person. So at least give me a cent. That's what lots of people would expect that capitalists would do. But interestingly, that never happens. Almost never happens anywhere. Because people have this intuitive sense for justice. Even in a relationship with strangers, even if it's not a repeated game, they get closer to something like handing a third to even half to the other person.
$8?
$8.
And the 12 is yours to keep? Okay. So you got $10.
Got $10, yeah.
Do you accept Sean's offer of $10?
I do accept Sean's offer.
But the most interesting thing is that in which countries, from Missouri to Ethiopia to Mongolia, in which countries and places are people most generous in their offers? You wouldn't have guessed it. In capitalist society.
Because we're used to bargaining. We have to give something to get something.
That's right. In places where people have more of buying and selling in their everyday lives. There are even studies in Ethiopia among 53 different groups trying to see who is most generous in a transaction, in an economic game. And it shows you that the closer people live to marketplaces, the more generous they are. So if they constantly buy and sell and negotiate, they begin to take other people's interests into consideration. That's what markets do. They do affect our character, but not in this way that the critics say that it makes us more divisive and aggressive and neglect the interests of others. It makes us more generous. And in fact, this is what Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels also said, those authors of another manifesto. They noticed that, look, the friendlier you are, the more beneficial it is to you in capitalism. And obviously they saw that as a bad thing. It wasn't real generosity. You were just being generous to help yourself. But I, for one, think it's better if we can get bad people to behave in good ways rather than good people behaving in bad ways that we've seen in Marxist society.
Comparing willingness to donate blood, organs, bone marrow, give to charity, volunteer, help strangers, it's the capitalist countries that win?
And this is a surprise to the researchers, because so many people expect us in capitalist, individualist societies to just elbow our way through life. But it seems like it's quite the opposite. It's in capitalist societies that we behave in the most generous way. And one reason could be that we're free to do that. We're not forced into self-sacrificial relationships with others. And if you are allowed to go about your own business and improve the lives of yourselves and of those around you, then you might be more likely to also extend a helping hand to others.
Moving on to growth.
Our addiction to economic growth is killing us.
Growth is not killing us, it is saving us. It's an incredibly strong correlation between economic growth in a society and a reduction in poverty, better health, less child mortality. Growth is most important for people who have the least. In poor countries, if you open up your economy, if you manage to grow by 4% annually over 20 years, that reduces poverty in that country on average by 80%.
All right, so far, but growth means climate change is worse.
It means a future of climate chaos.
In fact, the risk of dying in a climate-related natural disaster has declined by some 90% since the 1950s. And that's not because we have fewer disasters or because there is no global warming. It's because we are wealthier than we've ever been before, because we've had economic growth. And it means that we improve construction, we improve early warning systems, we improve healthcare, which means that we can deal with all these problems and all disasters in a better way than we would otherwise have had. If we didn't have any economic growth since the 1950s, yes, surely we would have slightly less global warming, but many more people, around 500,000 more people, would die because of climate-related natural disasters.
But the activists claim
our addiction to making and consuming more stuff is exhausting the planet.
More than 1,000 so-called experts signed this letter,
calling for an end to a capitalist system which pursues growth at all costs. Instead, they advocated for degrowth.
A smaller, slower economy could also be a sweeter economy.
We've just had an experiment with degrowth, unintentionally, during the pandemic.
Suspending all travel from Europe.
States urging people to stay home.
The whole world shut down and half the world's population was under house arrest. All the flights were grounded. Did that save us? No, it was a terrible tragedy for humanity.
Take care.
60 million people were thrown into extreme poverty in that 1 year alone, 2020. And how much did this reduce CO2 emissions? By no more than 6%. So if we wanted to reduce global warming like the Paris Climate Accords just tell us to do until 2030, by doing less, then we would need one pandemic like that every year until 2030, without any rebound in between. And that would be a terrible disaster for human life and health.
Even a little growth makes a huge beneficial difference.
Yeah, compounded interest is the greatest force in the universe. If Sweden, my own country, had had just 1 percentage point lower economic growth per capita since we started to become rich, then Sweden today would be as poor as Albania.
What's wrong with Albania?
There's nothing much wrong with Albania, but Albanians are a quarter as rich as Swedes, and that shows in everything from life expectancy and child mortality to working conditions, to how you can invest in taking care of the environment. It tells you that growth is not really about money. It's about opportunity. It's about the chance of doing the things that we want to do with our lives and for our society and for our young and for our old.
Today, people in Albania risk their lives and safety to get to places like Sweden.
Albanians now make up the single largest group arriving in small boats.
And that's what you need to know about different economic and political systems. Look at where the refugees go. They always go from more oppressed societies to freer societies, from more socialist economies to capitalist economies. People risk their lives to get to freedom and to prosperity. And that's a more important indicator than the fantasies of some intellectuals about where they should be heading. In that case, the refugees would find a stream of people moving from the loneliness and hopelessness in the US down south.
So what's up with the intellectuals? It's not just now. Forever they have embraced socialism.
I think there's always a temptation for the most educated and intellectual people in a society to think that common people are vulgar and they're hopeless, and they can't see how they can really thrive and find meaning in such a shallow society with the kind of media and the Taco Tuesdays that we've got. So I think that intellectuals often search for something else. They want people to reach for something that they find more of meaning into. And since Plato, they often think that they should be the kings themselves.
Angela Davis, famous socialist.
Yeah, racism is integrally linked to capitalism, and I think it's a mistake to assume that we can combat racism by leaving capitalism in place.
I classify racism and capitalism as these conjoined twins. In order to truly be anti-racist, you also have to truly be anti-capitalist.
What? That's complete nonsense. When you look around the world, the least racist societies with the fewest expressions of racist attitudes are the most capitalist countries. And why is that? Capitalism is the first economic system where you only get rich by opening up opportunities for others, for customers, for workers, for other businesses. And in that case, it pays to be colorblind. It pays to be open to willing customers and to workers who could enrich your company and to do business with other businesses, no matter religion or race or what if they happen to cheer for another team. Doesn't mean that every person will be colorblind. There will always be idiots. But in capitalism, it's costly to be an idiot.
In the Jim Crow South, it was businesses that fought Jim Crow because they were losing money.
It's often forgotten that owners of buses, railways, streetcars in the American South didn't really segregate systematically until the late 19th century. Why didn't they do that? It was probably not because they were less racist than others in the South, but they were capitalists. They wanted money, they wanted clients, and they didn't want to engage in some sort of costly and brutal policing business in segregating buses. Rosa Parks in Alabama, who famously got on board that bus and protested against segregation. Well, buses in Alabama wasn't segregated until the year 1900 because the owners were capitalists. And that's exactly why the rulers in the American South instituted laws, Jim Crow laws, to force them to segregate their businesses because they didn't like greedy capitalists who weren't willing to discriminate against the blacks because it was costly to them.
They cared about green, money, dollars, not black or white.
Yeah, the first rule of business is don't reject willing paying customers and don't harass them, because they won't like what you're doing. So the owners of these transport companies in the South, they try to avoid those laws, bypass them secretly and fight them in courts. And they were often fined. And the owners were threatened with being imprisoned by southern states because they weren't willing to discriminate. And that's exactly why we got Jim Crow laws, because free markets weren't willing to discriminate. We can taking care of then point any
dependent upon whether or not Ukraine can effectively employ these systems and sustain those systems, and whether or not Ukraine can mobilize an adequate number of troops to replenish its ranks. And so we continue to work on all those things simultaneously. And we really want Ukraine to be successful. We've invested a lot. This is really important, not just for Ukraine, but for the world, and for all the reasons that you heard me talk about in my opener. So.
General Brown, can Ukraine win?
Well, the key part here is to make sure Ukraine can defend itself. And as the Secretary highlighted, I've talked about here recently, is that unchecked aggression leads to more aggression. And so this is why it is so important for us to put Ukraine in a place that it can defend itself, and that we don't have this broaden to a much wider conflict. And when I think about how World War II started, or previous world wars, this is why this is so important that we have Ukraine Defense Contact Group and all the nations around the world that are focused on ensuring Ukraine is successful.
And Ukraine can be successful if it has the right amount of security assistance. So we are all very grateful for Congress passing the supplemental. And again, if you think about what Russia intended to do early on, what its strategic objectives were, and the fact that it failed to achieve any strategic objectives, and 2 years later, 793 days later, Ukraine is still fighting and still holding its ground. And that's quite remarkable. And it's holding that ground even in the face of a question as to whether or not we were going to continue to support them. That question is off the table now. And that has reassured the Ukrainians, but also it's reassured our allies and partners around the globe as well.
For the Washington Post, Dan.
Mr. Secretary, thanks for your time today. National Security Advisor Sullivan raised the concern this week about there being a catch-up period in terms of getting interceptors and some of this new aid to Ukraine. Can you speak to, I guess, the vulnerabilities, the concerns that we're in this particularly sensitive time? And then, Mr. Chairman, there's reporting out this week suggesting that Ukraine has had to pull the Abrams tanks that the United States sent, in part due to concerns about the FPV drone threat. Can you confirm if that's true and put it into, I guess, a larger context of what it means in the battlefield?
Thanks for the question. I would say that the commitment that the United States has made is material. It's real. It's substantial. And we're going to do everything we can to get that security assistance to the Ukrainians as quickly as possible. You heard us talk about, you heard General Ryder mention a couple of days ago that we had done some things to pre-position stocks in Europe so that we could buy down the amount of time that it took to get certain types of things into the hands of the Ukrainian. But even with that, this is not instantaneous. It's going to take some time to get things in the country, and then, most importantly, distributed to the point of need. But if you consider the fact that even without that, the Ukrainians were able to hold their own for a period of time, with this capability, we expect that they'll be able to do a lot better. And as I may have indicated earlier, they are doing some additional things to mobilize additional troops to replenish their ranks, and I think all those things are going to come together to put them in a much better place. But it will take a little time. As I talk to the Ukrainian leadership, they're confident that they can continue to hold their own, and then as they get a bit stronger, they'll have options available to them.
Dan, I appreciate the question. I'll defer to the Ukrainians on how they use their Abrams. But I will highlight the use of first-person view drones by both sides and the innovation that has occurred in this conflict with that capability. And there's something that I think we can all learn from how we were able to adapt in conflict. And that the character of war using various weapon systems through innovation. This is why, as an Air Force Chief of Staff and as a Chairman, I've been very focused about how we bring innovation and how we move much more quickly to ensure we can adapt in any type of battlefield environment, and watching that happen in the battle there in Ukraine.
Tony Bloomberg.
A couple questions. One on the $6 billion USIA commitment. Can you flesh that out a little bit? What types of systems are you talking about? And we're talking about years now, not signed contracts going out today. Is that accurate? And for the chairman, a reality check on the package that went out the other day, what will it roughly allow Ukraine to do? Will it allow them to start a mini offensive, or is it more to become more on parity with the Russians now in terms of 155s, cluster munitions that you're sending, more defense versus offense?
Thanks, Tony. In terms of how long it will take to deliver the capability that we're investing in with USAI funds, it depends. It depends on the type of system. As you know, some of the platforms have a much longer lead time to construct, and as well as some of the munitions. So it depends. You can rest assured that we're going to move as fast as we can to get them the capability, as fast as industry can produce, but we will move at the speed of industry. And we're investing in industry as well so that they can expand their capacity. And some of what's in that supplemental allows us to do that. The types of things that we're investing in are the same types of things that you heard us talk about earlier. You know, they need air defense interceptors. They need artillery systems and munitions. They need armored vehicles. They need maintenance and sustainment. So all of those kinds of things are included in that USAI package.
And Tony, what this package allows gives the Ukrainians is a bit more flexibility. As you might imagine, not knowing when this supplemental, we very much appreciate that the supplemental was approved.
Yes.
They've had to actually ration, conserve munitions over time. And so with this package and the follow-on package, because of the supplemental, gives them a bit more flexibility to be able to operate and use that capability effectively against the Russian threat.
Okay, let's go to VOA and then I'll monitor.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. What made you change your mind on providing long-range ATACMS? Will they be included in the $1 billion package that was announced earlier this week? And since you talked about this will take time, has any of the aid from the $1 billion package actually reached Ukraine at this point? And then, Mr. Chairman, analysts are cautioning us that it will take a lot of time before we'll see the effects of this current aid on the battlefield. When do you think that Ukrainians will have the opportunity to again have the upper hand?
In terms of the provision of ATACMS, as you know, we had provided the Ukrainians ATACMS before. They come in various types with different ranges. And of course, there are mixtures of munitions here going forward. And I won't get specific in terms of what we provided and whether or not and when the Ukrainians will actually put those munitions to use. But the key point is they have the capability. Now, that capability alone is not a silver bullet. It's the integration of that capability with the other kinds of things like Storm Shadow and other things that other countries are providing that really then gives them a capability to conduct a long-range fires campaign. And so I think that's what's most important. But in terms of specifics of, how many and where, I'll let the Ukrainians speak to that.
If I may follow, officials had expressed before concerns that that the Ukraine may try to fire ATACMS into Russia, or that there weren't enough in U.S. stockpiles. Did either of those affect your decision to provide the long-range ATACMS?
Well, first of all, as you know, I always have a concern about the United States having the capability to defend itself and to also support our operational plans. And I can tell you that we are comfortable that we are in a good place, and we will remain in a good place. In 2 years' time, things change. More munitions are created, and that sort of business. So we are in a good place. We'll remain in a good place, and I think the capability that Ukraine will have is a good capability. It's up to them on how and when to use it, and our hopes are that they'll create some pretty good effects with that and other things.
Well, to your question, I can't necessarily predict a timeline of where, for the future of where the Ukrainians will have an upper hand, but we can shape the future. And that's exactly what this supplement has been able to do, is to help shape the future. And I think you asked about how long will it have effect. I think there's some near-term effect, because now the Ukrainians don't necessarily have to ration what they have, because they know things are coming out of this package, and there will be follow-on packages because of the supplemental, which gives them a bit more flexibility and options to be able to execute. The one thing I would highlight to you, even during this time frame, the Russians have had incremental gains at tremendous cost and loss of personnel, loss of combat capability. And so I do see the Ukrainians with this additional support, not only from our supplemental, but as I've engaged with, matter of fact, engaged with a number of my counterparts this morning, they highlighted how important our supplemental was to actually help lead. And as I said in my opening remarks, leaders don't stand on the sidelines, and the fact that we step up and provide this supplemental helps to energize, and we saw some of that today as we engage with the counterparts in the UDCG.
And so the Russians have increased their production of artillery munitions and other things, but they're also being propped up by the likes of North Korea and Iran, and they had to go that direction because of the damage, to the chairman's point, the damage that the Ukrainians had inflicted on the land forces there. So I think, with the capabilities, the resources that will be provided, hopefully Ukraine will have the ability to not only hold its own, but regenerate additional capability and then create options for itself going forward.
We have time for just a few more. We'll go to L Monitor and then CNN.
Thank you, gentlemen. Two questions. One on Iran's April 14th attack against Israel. I'm wondering if you could share some takeaways. What has the department learned operationally, and what does this attack say about Israel's qualitative military edge in relation to Iran's capabilities? Secondly, on the Gaza humanitarian peer operation, how confident are you in this integrated security plan with the Israeli military, and do you have any concerns that close proximity of the IDF to onshore logistics may draw Hamas fire and potentially put aid workers at risk?
Thanks. I'll take the first question and give the chairman a chance to swing at the second question, unless if you don't want to, Chairman, I'll take the second one as well. But he wants to, I can tell. What have we learned? Well, a lot of things have been learned. I think the Israelis were fairly confident going into this that they had the means and the technology to defend themselves. And I think what we saw kind of proved that. And there were in excess of 100 ballistic missiles fired at Israel. Only a couple got through. What we saw was a significant display of combined cooperation between partners and allies to work together to make that a bit easier, to make it a bit easier for Israel to defend itself. And all of that came together about like we thought it would, because of the fact that we trained together, we rehearsed on various things together with allies and partners, and I think what you saw was a result of that. Now, what the Iranians learned, I'm not really sure, but what they should learn is that, first of all, their systems don't work as advertised. That they employed a lot of munitions with the intent on creating significant damage in Israel, and none of that worked. So that should give them pause, and they should be questioning the effectiveness of their weapon systems and their planning, and I'm sure that some of that's probably going on right now. If not, it should be. So hopefully they don't walk away from this overconfident that they can do this at will. because I think Israel has demonstrated that it has a significant ability to defend itself.
Mr. Secretary, I appreciate you deferring the second question to me, but
anytime I can help, Chairman.
No, but even for the first question, I would just before I get to the second question, I'm very confident and proud of our joint force and what they were able to do with our allies and partners to be able to do what they did on that night. And thinking about one of the fighter squadrons showed up like a day prior, and they were right in the middle of the fight, and that says something to our level of training. Our level of capability, and then be able to do that as part of a joint team like that in the coalition. And having done integrated air missile defense, pretty much involved in it as a one-star, and having been the air component commander there, I kind of know what they went through. And again, I couldn't be prouder of them. On the second question on with the Israelis and the support for the pier. We are taking our force protection for the pier itself, but also the distribution area very seriously. And what the Israelis are doing, they're building basically a buffer zone or a bubble out around the distribution area in the pier to keep the threat away from our forces, and to allow not just from our forces, but also from the distribution of the aid. Because as you might imagine, we'll have contract trucks and the like, and the aid agencies that need to be protected as well. Because if that's not protected, then it interrupts the distribution of aid that's so important to the citizens of Gaza. I am.
Final question will go to CNN.
Thank you. I have one on Ukraine and one on Africa. So Russia's war machine is in full gear. As Chairman Brown said, it is aggressively reconstituting its military. And General Kondoli, European Command, said that Russia has, quote, grown back to what they were before they invaded in 2022, and they're quickly replenishing their ground forces as well. So my question is, why has Russia been able to reconstitute so effectively? And are the U.S. and its allies going to be able to keep up and surpass Russia's defense industrial capacity so that Ukraine doesn't fall behind? And then I have a second on Africa for the chairman.
Yeah, so great question. Yeah, I think I touched upon this a bit earlier when I said that Russia has ramped up its production. All of their defense industry really answers directly to the state, so it's it's easier for them to do that a bit quicker. But the reason that they're where they are right now is because they've relied on the likes of North Korea and Iran to prop them up. And without that, they'd be in a much worse position. And with that, even with that, you asked whether or not we're going to be able to increase production in a way that not only enables Ukraine, but also allows us to replenish our inventories across the board. And my answer is yes. We have been focused on expanding the capacity of the industrial base for some time. What's in that supplemental, as I said earlier, there are monies in that supplemental that enable us to do that. And in our industrial base, as I have engaged the leaders of many of the companies, they are digging in and moving out and looking for ways to shorten production times and expand capacity. Unfortunately, none of that's instantaneous. But when the United States is faced with a challenge, we will rise to meet that challenge. We always have and we always will.
And Chairman Brown, the U.S. is preparing to fully withdraw troops from Niger, and Special Operations Forces, according to reports, will be withdrawn from Chad as well. So how will these withdrawals affect the U.S.'s counterterrorism operations there? And more broadly, is the U.S. losing to China and Russia on the continent?
Well, one of the areas that we're focused on is to continue our CT operations and continue our influence and work with many of the African nations that are on the continent. And so as we are working through and adjusting, this is a conversation I've had with General Langley on how we can still continue to do our counterterrorism at the same time to our influence and work with the various nations within the region. And so it's important that we stay engaged, and that's what we're doing. And as we have to shift, as we work with the various countries, As the Secretary has told me several times, we've got to have willing partners in certain areas to make sure we are able to execute. And that's something that AFRICOM is working through as we adjust. And we've proven that we can do counterterrorism any place in the world. We have the capability to strike and hold any target at risk anywhere in the world. And again, that's why I'm so proud of our military and our capability. We have to adjust sometimes based on the dynamics. Yes, we do. But that's the capability we have for our force to be able to adjust.
The broader question of influence, losing it to China and Russia?
Well, I mean, this is part of the conversation we've had. It's CT, but at the same time, our influence as we work with the various nations. And I think one of the things that I find is I've engaged not just in Africa but around the world how much U.S. leadership is valued, and some of our adversaries will do things financially, but do not have that long-term relationship with shared values, shared objectives that we have with many of our partners around the world.
It's a big continent, and there are many countries on the continent that really do, to the chairman's point, value their relationship with the United States. I was just in Africa in the fall, and I was struck by how true that was, or is, that countries really value their relationship with us. And in some cases, countries that we haven't had a strong relationship with in the past are stepping forward saying that they'd like to have a better relationship with the United States. So.
Secretary Austin, General Brown, thank you very much, gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our press briefing. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
We will hear argument this morning.
At 1512, we would submit that said an untenable proposition to figure out what a potential harm to another person might be, looking at what came before.
Well,
that doesn't.
And I'm sorry, Mr. Green. Go ahead. Finish your sentence.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that the court's holding about how to construe a statute and its significant holding about otherwise was abrogated in and of itself as a result of the cases that came after Begay.
Well, I'm not a fan of Begay. Some of us perceived at that time that there were different problems with what the court did there. But I think there's a point in the colloquy that you've been having. The specific types of conduct that are enumerated in 1, alter, destroy, mutilate, conceal a record, document, etc., have two things in common. 1, they all involve documents or objects, and they also all involve the impairment of the object's integrity or availability for use in an official proceeding. So the similarity could be either of those things. And so I think that you may be biting off more than you can chew by suggesting, if you are indeed suggesting, that the otherwise clause can only be read the way you read it. One might say it can certainly be read the way the government reads it, and that might even be the more straightforward reading. But it is also possible to read a clause like this more narrowly, and Judge Katz has provided an example of that in his opinion. If you had a statute that says anyone who kills or injures or assaults someone or otherwise causes serious injury, commits a crime, you wouldn't think that that applies to defamation. So it could be read your way. So then I think you have to go on to some other arguments and explain why your reading is better than the government's reading.
Certainly, and I would submit, Your Honor, that there are plenty of other reasons why our reading is the better reason. And I'm not going to contest or bite off more than I can chew and say that the government's reading of C2 is implausible. We think it's unsound, but it's unsound for the additional reasons that if one zooms out and looks at what the prohibited conduct is in 1512 generally, we are talking about interference or operation on forms of evidence and testimony that obstruct a proceeding. That's what 12 is all about generally. And I would submit, Your Honor, too, that as the briefing indicates, Jus Gem Generis and Nocitur Associus, those two venerated Latin canons, also operate in our favor here, as well as the broader context of Chapter 73 and Section 15. All of these things are about doing things that obstruct a proceeding. In 1512 and 1512C zero in on witnesses and evidence.
Well, you have other arguments. You have surplusage arguments. You have arguments about the breadth of the government's reading of the provision. Do you want to say anything about those?
Right. So with respect to surplusage, Your Honor, I would refer to Judge Katz's opinion, as you did, in particular in the Joint Appendix at page 88, which lists out all of the different provisions in Section 1512. 15 of the 21 would be subsumed by the government's reading of C2. The government's reading of C2, I remind the Court, is so broad that it would cover anyone who does something understanding that what they're doing is wrong in some way, that in any way influences, impedes, or obstructs an official proceeding of any type.
Well, Mr. Green, I
think
that
limited by federal.
There's a good case that this provision, everybody knew it was going to be superfluous because it was a provision that was meant to function as a backstop. It was a later enacted provision. Congress had all these statutes all over the place. It had just gone through Enron. What Enron convinced them of was that there were gaps in these statutes, and they tried to fill the gaps. They tried to fill the particular gap that they found out about in Enron. And then they said, you know, this is a lesson to us. There are probably other gaps in this statute. But they didn't know exactly what those gaps were. So they said, let's have a backstop provision. And this is their backstop provision. And of course, in that circumstance, I mean, superfluity is very often a good argument when it comes to statutory interpretation. But it's not a good argument when Congress is specifically devising a backstop provision to fill gaps that might exist. They don't exactly know how they exist, but they think that they probably do exist in a pre-existing statutory scheme. And that's what this provision is intended to do.
Respectfully, Your Honor, a close reading of Yates, both the majority opinion and the dissenting opinion, demonstrates that this Court thought that 1519 was the backstop. That was supposed to be the omnibus provision, and the Court was fighting over what the meaning of tangible object was in 1519. But that was meant to plug the hole.
Counsel,
that Congress...
I have such a hard time with the superfluidity argument because this entire obstruction section is superfluidity. There isn't one provision you can point to. You just said it. You can point to 1512 and you have 1519, which says destruction of evidence. How are they different? They're really not. You can point to any series, any provision, and point to superfluidity in this section, 1512 and otherwise. So we go back to Justice Kagan's position, which is what you don't have is a freestanding, otherwise obstructs, influence, or impedes any official proceeding. I don't see why that's not the backstop that Congress would have intended, and it's the language it used.
Well, it's an awfully odd place to put it, isn't it? I mean, in a subsection of a subsection in the middle back of the statute to include a provision that suddenly takes over 15 of the 21 other provisions.
The one thing that Justice Kagan pointed to, which is clear, they wanted to cover every base. And they didn't do it in a logical way. but they managed to cover every base.
Well, I think you can reconcile. I mean, again, that's what the court said about 1519 in Yates, and I don't understand how it is that the government can come before you today and say we need yet another catch-all, yet another omnibus crime that will sweep in all kinds of other. We didn't get what we wanted in Section 15, so now we'll go to 1512C2 and see if we can expand that in this way to cover something that it has never covered before.
Thank you, Counsel. Justice Thomas, Justice Alito, Justice Sotomayor.
We've never had a situation before where there's been a situation like this with people attempting to stop a proceeding violently. So I'm not sure what a lack of history proves.
Well, I'm not sure that that's true. I'd point to the Hatfield courthouse problems in Portland, Oregon. But let's also look at what the court has said in so many different cases, in Dubin, in Bond, in Yates, in Kelly. All of these cases.
But there was a difference in the use of words. Here, otherwise obstructs, influences, or impede. You might have a problem with breadth, and the government can address that. But it's not unclear what those words mean.
But the government has no way to address its problem with breadth.
Well, we can let them answer.
Okay.
Justice Kagan? Justice Kavanaugh?
If it were just the language in C2 and so said, whoever corruptly obstructs, influences, or impedes, C2 without the word otherwise, that were the whole provision, do you acknowledge that the language would then be applied properly to a situation like this?
Unfortunately, no. And the reason for that is that, again, applying all the other canons and applying the whole text canon and zooming out and looking at 1512, we would submit that C2 should still be read in the way we have suggested that it be read, as something that is an evidence impairment statute. I think also, as I mentioned, the Latin canons, the surplusage problem that C2 would create, all of those would still obtain if it sat there by itself without the otherwise. The otherwise is the icing on the cake. And finally, Justice Kavanaugh, I would mention that, as I mentioned to Justice Barrett, there's an issue.
If you didn't have C1, just had C2 without the otherwise, I'm not sure I was clear on that.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case, I think it gets even harder, but I would still say if we look at what 1512 is about, and if we look at this court's cases on broad, plausible, but broad readings of criminal statutes not being what the court adopts when there's an available narrow reading, because Congress can fix that, we would still say that C2 doesn't perform the massive dragnet function that the government submits.
Thank you.
Justice Barrett?
Yeah, I have a question about the phrase in C1, the specific intent. Do you agree it's specific intent with the intent to impair the object's integrity? Okay. What is your view about how that parenthetical applies to C2, if at all? Like, do you think that intent requirement carries over?
The corruptly intent requirement?
Not corruptly. With the intent to impair the object's integrity or availability for use in an official proceeding.
Yes, we do, Your Honor.
So it carries over.
And we'd say that's the object of the overarching mens rea.
But how can that be? I mean, it seems like that, C2 would read awfully oddly then. It would be otherwise obstructs, influences, or impedes any official proceeding with the intent to impair the object's integrity or availability for use in an official proceeding. That would be your position of how it would read?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, it's awkward. I mean, there's no doubt that it's an awkward statute. But if you do the operation that I talked about earlier, which is we're just going to use otherwise to replace the verbs and the nouns in C1, then the statute makes perfect sense. With respect to intent, I mean, I think Your Honor makes an excellent point, which is that this intent is a specific form of intent. The corruptly, which has been construed to be the mens rea up there, is not different than, at least on this reading, or on the accepted reading it by the D.C. Circuit right now, is not different than some form of specific intent.
So corruptly is redundant?
It seems like it's getting to be, yes.
Okay,
That's
thank
true,
you.
and our submission is that corruptly should mean something different. So should proceeding. That's how you marry 1512 with 1519.
Justice Jackson.
So I'm just still wondering if your theory about this provision might be too narrow in a sense, because you've got evidence going and spoliation in a sense. What I'm trying to work out in my mind is whether you would still have a decent argument if this 1512 language is read to prohibit the corrupt tampering with things that are used to conduct an official proceeding with the intent of undermining the integrity of the thing or access to the thing, and thereby obstructing the proceeding. It's not just evidence, it's an official proceeding. C1 is an example of, the corrupt tampering with certain things, and C2 broadens it out a bit. It's not just documents and records. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's a correct reading, Your Honor. I mean, it's as 1512F demonstrates. It doesn't, 1512F we would submit actually supports our position because it says the evidence need not be admissible or free of a privilege claim. Now, what would that mean about what the statute is addressing if it's not evidence? But that C2 has been applied, and occasionally C1 has been applied.
In a non-evidentiary way.
Yeah, to things that could become evidence, to the efforts to shape someone's grand jury testimony,
all right,
to answers to interrogatories.
Let me ask you about the question that Justice Barrett asked before. You suggested that it has to be to the document, but in other words, the activity has to be actually to the document. But I don't know why that's the case under C2. Justice Alito says, well, one of the commonalities between C1 and C2 could be the impairment of the object's integrity or availability. Justice Barrett posits a scenario in which you have someone who is impairing the availability by doing something to prevent the object from getting to the proceeding. Why wouldn't that count under C2? So this is preventing Congress from counting the electoral votes, for example. Let's say it's being done. She says it's in an envelope going to the vice president's desk, and someone does something to impair or prevent that from happening. Why isn't that what C2 could cover?
Well, first, it's not affecting the integrity of the document, Your Honor, or the
availability is also in the statute.
Availability, it says too, but as I mentioned earlier, simply delaying the arrival of evidence at the courthouse.
No, not delay. Let's say the person steals the envelope and takes it away.
Then it gets harder. I agree. They steal the envelopes, they take it away, they rip up all of those things, which is certainly not what happened here, and it's not in the indictment. The ballots or the vote count is not even in the indictment.
But we wouldn't have to decide that. We could send it back if we clarified that that is what the statute means. I'm trying to understand if you agree that that's what the statute could mean.
No, I don't agree that that's what the statute.
Why not?
The reason is that if you look at 1512, it is about a direct effect, or in some senses, an indirect effect, but in a limited way, on evidence that's to be used in a proceeding, right? And proceeding, as I mentioned earlier.
So as to limit its availability. So what I'm suggesting is in C2, if you're doing something to limit its availability, why doesn't it count?
Because we're limiting the availability of its use by a fact finder in a proceeding. Again, that's the way to marry 1519, which covers all kinds of investigations and all kinds of other events, with 1512. 1512 is talking about evidence that's going to a formal convocation, some kind of hearing before the Congress or before any other body.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, counsel.
Thank you.
General Prelogger.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court. On January 6, 2021, a violent mob stormed the United States Capitol and disrupted the peaceful transition of power. Many crimes occurred that day, but in plain English, the fundamental wrong committed by many of the rioters, including petitioner, was a deliberate attempt to stop the joint session of Congress from certifying the results of the election. That is, they obstructed Congress's work in that official proceeding. The government accordingly charged petitioner with violating Section 1512C2, an obstruction offense that directly reads onto his conduct. The case as it comes to this court presents a straightforward question of statutory interpretation. Did petitioner obstruct, influence, or impede the joint session of Congress? The answer is equally straightforward. Yes, he obstructed that official proceeding. The terms of the statute unambiguously encompass his conduct. Petitioner doesn't really argue that his actions fall outside the plain meaning of what it is to obstruct. Instead, he asked this court to impose an atextual limit on the actus reus. In his view, because Section 1512c1 covers tampering with documents and other physical evidence, the separate prohibition in Section 1512c2 should be limited to acts of evidence impairment. But that limit has no basis in the text or tools of construction. His reading hinges on the word otherwise, but that word means in a different manner, not in the same manner. And the true prohibitions in Section 1512c2 aren't unified items on a list where you could apply associated words canons. They're separate provisions. They have their own sets of verbs and their own nouns. They each independently prohibit attempts, which would be duplication that makes no sense on petitioner's reading. And Congress included a distinct mental state requirement in C1 that it chose not to repeat in C2. Section 1512c2, by its terms, is not limited to evidence impairment. Instead, it's a classic catch-all. C1 covers specified acts that obstruct an official proceeding, and C2 covers all other acts that obstruct an official proceeding in a different manner. The court should say so and allow this case to proceed to trial. I welcome the court's questions.
General, there have been many violent protests that have interfered with proceedings. Has the government applied this provision to other protests in the past, and has this been the government's position throughout the lifespan of the statute?
It has certainly been the government's position since the enactment of 1512c2 that it covers the myriad forms of obstructing an official proceeding and that it's not limited to some kind of evidence impairment loss.
Have you enforced it in that manner?
We have enforced it in a variety of prosecutions that don't focus on evidence tampering. Now, I can't give you an example of enforcing it in a situation where people have violently stormed a building in order to prevent an official proceeding, a specified one, from occurring with all of the elements like intent to obstruct, knowledge of the proceeding, having the corruptly mens rea, but that's just because I'm not aware of that circumstance ever happening prior to January 6th. But just to give you a flavor of some of the other circumstances where we have prosecuted under this provision, for example, there are situations where we've brought C2 charges because someone tipped off the subject of an investigation to the grand jury's hearings. There was another case where someone tipped off about the identity of an undercover law enforcement officer, and in those situations, there's no specific evidence, no concrete testimony or physical evidence that the conduct is interfering with. Instead, it's more general obstruction of the proceeding. Justice Alito mentioned the Wright case as well, and that's another one where it was a forged court order that prompted the litigant to dismiss a mandamus petition, but that didn't have anything to do with the evidence that was going to be considered in that proceeding.
So what role does C1 play in your analysis?
So we understand 1512C to split up the world of obstructive conduct of an official proceeding into the C1 offense and into C2. C1 covers everything it enumerates. It's the acts of altering, concealing, destroying records, documents, or other objects. And then C2 would only pick up conduct that obstructs an official proceeding in a different way. So there's no duplication or superfluity on our reading. Instead, Congress was taking this universe and dividing it up into the two separate offenses. And I think that's actually a virtue of our reading as compared to petitioners, because I have not heard him articulate anything that would fall within C1 that wouldn't also come within C2. So on his reading, C2 really does just swallow C1 whole.
Well, I mean, in the way you're reading it, C2 almost exists in isolation, certainly not affected by C1.
We don't deny at all that there is a relationship between the two provisions, Justice Thomas.
What is that relationship?
And the relationship is the one Congress specified in the text. It's what follows the word otherwise. That is the relevant degree of similarity. What both C1 and C2 have in common is that they or aim at conduct that obstructs an official proceeding. C1 does so in one way, tampering with records and documents. C2 does so with respect to all other conduct that in a different manner does that. And I think that this has to be the road the court goes down, to look at what Congress actually prescribed with respect to similarity. Because in contrast, if you take up petitioner's invitation to come up with some atextual gloss from C1 to port over into C2, I don't understand what the court could look at to guide its determination of exactly what the relevant similarity would be.
General, I'm sure you've had a chance to read our opinion released Friday in the Boysonet case. It was unanimous. It was very short. But it explained how to apply the doctrine of justum generis. And what it said is that specific terms, more general catch-all, if you will, term at the end, and it said that the general phrase is controlled and defined by reference to the terms that precede it. The otherwise phrase is more general, and the terms that precede it are alters, destroys, mutilates, or conceals a record and document. And applying the doctrine as was set forth in that opinion, the specific terms alters, destroy, and mutilate carry forward into 2, and the terms record, document, or other object carry forward into 2 as well. And it seems to me that they, as I said, sort of control and defined the more general term.
So, Mr. Chief Justice, I think that the statute...
I'm sorry, just to interrupt, so I put out exactly what... And the otherwise means in other ways. It alters, destroys, and mutilates record, document, or other objects that impede the investigation, and otherwise, in other ways, accomplishes the same result.
So I think the problem with that approach with respect to 1512 is that it doesn't look like the typical kind of statutory phrase that consists of a parallel list of nouns or a parallel list of verbs where the court has applied a justum generis or the Noscator canon. These are separate prohibitions that have their own complex, non-parallel internal structure. And I think actually the best evidence that it's hard to figure out how you would define a degree of similarity between them just based on the word otherwise is that there are multiple competing interpretations at issue in this case. Justice Alito touched on them, and they're reflected in the competing interpretations between Judge Katsas on the D.C. Circuit and Judge Nichols on the District Court.
Competing interpretations of what?
And it relates to exactly the question you asked me, which is that Judge Nichols thought that C1 should limit to C2, and he looked at it and said, well, the relevant thing about C1 is it deals with records, documents, and other objects. And so that means C2 should be limited only to other acts that impair physical evidence. Meanwhile, Judge Katsas looked at the specific intent requirement in C1 to take action that impairs the availability or use of the evidence, and he divined a broader gloss to put on C2 and said it should be other impairment of all other evidence.
Well, they're just applying the same doctrine to different aspects of it, and I think you do that as well. What are the common elements? Alters, destroy, and mutilates a record or a document. You have the first few, what you're doing, and what you're doing it to, and you apply both of those, as it said in Boysonet, controlling and defining the term that follows, so that it should involve something that's capable of alteration, destruction, and mutilation, and with respect to a record or a document. That's how
I actually don't even understand.
When you apply that doctrine, again, as we did on Friday, it responds to some of the concerns that have been raised about how broad C2 is. You can't just tack it on and say, look at it as if it's standing alone, because it's not.
So let me respond to that in 2 ways. I do want to have a chance to address any concerns about breadth. But the more fundamental point, I think, is that I don't even understand petitioner to be suggesting that you can mix and match the verbs and the nouns from C1 and C2 in this way. Judge Nichols had a more limited view that C2 exclusively focuses on physical objects. It wouldn't apply to things like testimony because of the limitation that he gleaned from C1. Judge Katsas, I think, maybe in line with your question, would interpret it more broadly. And the basic point as a textual matter is that there is nothing in the text of C2 itself to disclose what the relevant similarity from C1 ought to be. Instead, we think the relevant similarity is obstruction of an official proceeding, because that's the language Congress chose.
General, if that's the case, what work does authorize do on your theory? Because I think I might, as I'm hearing you, think that whoever corruptly obstructs, influences, or impedes any official proceeding or attempts to do so stands alone. And the otherwise, I'm not hearing what work it does. Can you explain to me what work it does on your view?
Yes. So the work that otherwise does is to set up the relationship between C1 and C2 and make clear that C2 does not cover the conduct that's encompassed by C1. Now, I acknowledge that there would have been...
Beyond that, beyond saying, okay, C1 does some things, and the whole rest of the universe of obstructing, impeding, or influencing is conducted by C2. Is that a fair summary of your view?
Yes, but there was a good reason for Congress to do it this way.
I
traces to the statutory history.
I understand
and
that.
I would just say that,
if I might, so what does that mean for the breadth of this statute? Would a sit-in that disrupts a trial or access to a federal courthouse qualify? Would a heckler in today's audience qualify, or at the State of the Union address? Would pulling a fire alarm before a vote qualify for 20 years in federal prison?
there are multiple elements of the statute that I think might not be satisfied by those hypotheticals, and it relates to the point I was going to make to the Chief Justice about the breadth of this statute. The kind of built-in limitations are the things that I think would potentially suggest that many of those things wouldn't be something the government could charge or prove as 1512c2 beyond a reasonable doubt, would include the fact that the actus reus does require obstruction, which we understand to be a meaningful interference. So that means that if you have some minor disruption or delay or some minimal outburst, we don't think it falls within the actus reus to begin with.
My outbursts require the court to reconvene after the proceeding has been brought back into line, or the pulling of the fire alarm, the vote has to be rescheduled, or the protest outside of a courthouse makes it inaccessible for a period of time. Are those all federal felonies subject to 20 years in prison?
So with some of them, it would be necessary to show nexus. So with respect to the protest outside the courthouse, we'd have to show that, yes, they were aiming at the proceeding.
They were trying to stop the proceeding.
Yes, and then we'd also have to be able to prove that they acted corruptly, and this sets a stringent mens rea. It's not even just the mere intent to obstruct. We have to show that also, but we have to show that they had corrupt intent in acting in that way.
We went around that tree yesterday.
I know. I heard the argument yesterday, but I guess what I would say is that to the extent that your hypotheticals are pressing on the idea of a peaceful protest, even one that's quite disruptive, it's not clear to me that the government would be able to show that each of those protesters had corrupt intent.
So mostly peaceful protest that actually obstructs and impedes an official proceeding for an indefinite period would not be covered?
Not necessarily. We would just have to have the evidence of intent, and that's a high bar.
They intend to do it, all right.
Yes, if they intend to obstruct and were able to show that they knew that was wrongful conduct with consciousness of wrongdoing, then yes, that's a 1512c2 offense. And
what does corruptly add, in your view?
So corruptly adds the requirement that the defendant's conduct be wrongful and committed with consciousness of wrongdoing. And this traces to the court's decision in Arthur Anderson, where the court said this is a term with deep historical roots, with a settled meaning, and that it connotes not just knowledge of your actions, which is, the intent to obstruct in this case, but further requires that it be done corruptly. And just to give you a more concrete example of how this has played out in the January 6 prosecutions, I'd point to the jury instruction in the Robertson case, which we refer to and quote in part on page 44 of our brief. There, the jury was instructed that in order to show the defendant acted corruptly, the jury had to conclude that he had an unlawful purpose or used unlawful means or both, and that he had consciousness of wrongdoing. So I think that that is an encapsulation of what the jury is asked to decide on top of the mere intent to obstruct.
Well, General, let me give you a specific example, which picks up but provides a little bit more detail with respect to one of the examples that Justice Gorsuch provided. So we've had a number of protests in the courtroom. Let's say that today, while you're arguing or Mr. Green is arguing, 5 people get up, one after the other, and they shout either keep the January 6th insurrectionists in jail or free the January 6th patriots. And as a result of this, our police officers have to remove them forcibly from the courtroom. And let's say we have to it delays the proceeding for 5 minutes. And I know that experienced advocates like you and Mr. Green are not going to be flustered by that, but, in another case, an advocate might lose his or her train of thought and not provide the best argument. So would that be a violation of 1512c2?
I think it would be difficult for the government to prove that.
Why?
At the outset, we don't think that 1512C2 picks up minimal, de minimis, minor interferences. We think that the term obstruct on its face connotes a meaningful interference with the proceeding.
Well, it doesn't say, I'm sorry, C2 does not refer just to obstruct. It says obstructs, influences, or impedes. Impedes is something less than obstructs.
I think that this is a verb phrase where iteration was obviously afoot, and impedes is also thought of as
meaning. You're preaching the plain meaning interpretation of this provision. The plain meaning of impede in Webster's is to interfere with or get in the way of the progress of, to hold up. In the OED, it is to retard in progress or action by putting obstacles in the way. So it doesn't require obstruction. It requires the causing of delay.
And if this
so again, why wouldn't that fall within? Now, you say, well, we're not going to prosecute that. And indeed, for all the protests that have occurred in this court, the Justice Department has not charged any serious offenses, and I don't think any one of those protesters has been sentenced to even 1 day in prison. But why isn't that a violation of 1512C2?
We read the actus reus more narrowly. Now, perhaps you could look at some of the broader dictionary definitions and adopt a broader understanding of the actus reus. Still, there would be the backstop of needing to prove corrupt intent. I think that's a stringent mens rea.
Well, that's not a corrupt intent. It's wrongful. Do you think it's not wrongful?
I could imagine defendants in that scenario suggesting that they thought they had some protected free speech right to protest. They might say that they weren't conscious of the fact that they weren't allowed to make that kind of brief protest in the court. And I think it's in a fundamentally different posture than if they had stormed into this courtroom, overrun the Supreme Court police, required the justices and other participants to flee for their safety, and done so with clear evidence of intent to obstruct.
Absolutely. What happened on January 6th was very, very serious, and I'm not equating this with that. But we need to find out what are the outer reaches of this statute under your interpretation. Let me give you another example. Yesterday, protesters blocked the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco and disrupted traffic in San Francisco. What if something similar to that happened all around the Capitol, so that all the bridges from Virginia were blocked, and members from Virginia who needed to appear at a hearing couldn't get there or were delayed in getting there? Would that be a violation of this provision?
It sounds to me like that wouldn't satisfy the proceeding element nor the nexus requirement.
Why would it not satisfy the proceeding? Let's say they want to get to the Capitol to vote.
Well, if we had clear evidence that the purpose of the protesters who had set up the blockage somewhere, some distance away from the court, was because they had a specific proceeding in mind, maybe you have the proceeding, but still the court has required a nexus, and that's been the requirement in cases like Marinello, Aguilar, and Arthur Anderson, where the court has said it does real narrowing work, because you have to show that the natural and probable effect of the action is to obstruct. There has to be a relationship in time, causation, and logic. But Justice Alito, the other thing I would say to this set of concerns is that there are other obstruction provisions, including in 1503, 1505, the tax obstruction statute 7212, that use this exact same formulation that the court has characterized as an omnibus clause and never suggested could be subject to an evidence gloss. So I don't think that, to the extent you have concerns about those hypotheticals, your question about what would happen in this courtroom could be covered by 1503. And interpreting this statute narrowly isn't going to cure that issue.
Let me give you one more example. An attorney is sanctioned under Rule 11 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure by filing pleadings, written motions, or other papers for the purpose of causing unnecessary delay or needlessly increasing the cost of litigation. And in a particular case, the judge imposes Rule 11 sanctions and says, this caused a lot of trouble. I can tell you it caused at least 5 work days for me personally, all of this unnecessary paper. And it delayed the progress of this litigation. So I'm imposing Rule 11 sanctions. Why doesn't that fall within your interpretation of this provision?
Congress created a specific safe harbor in 1515C. It's reprinted at page 17A to the appendix of our brief that specifies that advocacy or legal representation that is conducted as part of a proceeding shouldn't be understood as obstruction. So I think Congress was itself trying to draw some lines around participation obstruction in a proceeding on the one hand versus external forces that obstruct the proceeding on the other.
But it falls within the language, doesn't it?
What kind of evidence do you typically present in these January 6th cases to prove the corruptly element?
So the January 6 prosecutions require us to show first that the defendants had knowledge that Congress was meeting in the joint session on that day. We have to show that the defendants specifically intended to disrupt the joint proceeding. And then with respect to using unlawful means with consciousness of wrongdoing, we have focused on things like the defendants' threats of violence, willingness to use violence here. We allege that petitioner assaulted a police officer. We have focused on things like preparation for violence, bringing tactical gear or paramilitary equipment to the Capitol. And I want to emphasize, Justice Kagan, that this is a stringent mens rea requirement that has very much constrained the U.S. Attorney's Office. We've charged over 1,350 defendants with crimes committed on January 6th, but we've only had the evidence of intent to bring charges against 350 for a 1512
So how do you
violation.
make that decision? How do you decide which defendants get charged under this statute as opposed to not?
The dividing line has hinged usually on the evidence we have of intent. So we're looking for clear evidence that the defendant knew about the proceedings that were happening in the joint session in Congress that day, clear knowledge of the official proceeding. We've looked for evidence that the defendant specifically intended to prevent Congress from certifying the vote, and so used his actions to obstruct that proceeding. And then also, as I'd mentioned, the knowledge of wrongfulness or unlawful conduct can come about with respect to particular preparations that the defendants have made. And, there are a number of cases where even though we thought we had the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, there have been acquittals because there was, testimony that was credited that the defendant thought the proceedings were over and wasn't intending to obstruct. Or one person thought and said he thought that law enforcement was waving him into the building. So even in situations where we think we have amassed the evidence, we still haven't always been able to sustain these convictions, and it's because of the stringent mens rea.
General, can I ask you about your obstruction theory? Because you said that you see 1512C as dividing the world of an obstruction, and that the nexus between 1 and 2 is the official proceeding and the obstruction of an official proceeding. I guess what I'm concerned about is how you then account for the rest of 1512, where official proceeding comes up over and over again, and particular acts that one could view as obstructing the official proceeding, like killing or threatening or intimidating witnesses, is covered. So that if we read C2 to be obstructing an official proceeding, I don't understand what happens to the rest of those provisions.
So to the extent you're pressing on the idea that there's surplusage, I don't think that that's true. There is certainly overlap or duplication. That's true on both of the readings in this case. I think in part it might even be more true on petitioner's reading, because he says that C2 is likewise focused on all of the evidence impairment ways to obstruct, interfering with testimony, interfering with documents, and so forth. And so that very same duplication is going to be present on his reading. But with respect to superfluity, our interpretation doesn't create any technical superfluity, and that's because each of those other provisions that you cited, and in fact each of the other provisions of the obstruction laws, cover situations that 1512C2 wouldn't cover. There are three principal distinctions. The first is that some of them have less than a corruptly mens rea. So for many of the provisions, they can be violated in ways that wouldn't require the government to prove corruptly, and it might mean that we could charge particular applications of those provisions under them and not under C2. The second thing is that some of the provisions sweep more broadly than an official proceeding. They apply in a wider range of circumstances. So that would enable us to charge in those situations where we can't actually prove the official proceeding element. And then third and finally, some of the provisions have a higher penalty, specifically because they target more culpable conduct. And that's like 1512A, the one you referenced about killing a witness. There, the government would charge under that provision because it's subject to higher penalties than C2.
All right,
so there's no actual.
Can I ask you, would the government necessarily lose in the sense that they would not be able to bring charges against some of the people that you have described with Justice Kagan if we looked at C2 as being more limited, perhaps not all the way to evidence, but related to conduct that prevents or obstructs an official proceeding insofar as it is directed to preventing access to information or documents or records or things that the official proceeding would use. I explored with Mr. Green, and as did Justice Barrett, the idea that to the extent that there were people who knew that the votes were being counted that day, and that's done in a documentary way in our system, they're interfering by storming the Capitol might qualify under even an evidence or document interpretation of C2. What does the government think about that?
Yes, I think that if the court articulated the standard that way, these would likely be viable charges. And as we note in the last footnote of our brief, we've preserved an argument that we could satisfy even an evidence-related understanding of C2, in part because the very point of the conduct when we have the intent evidence was to prevent Congress from being able to count the votes, from being able to actually certify the results of the election. Now, we'd obviously need to evaluate whether these charges can go forward based on whatever this court says, and I would very much caution the court away from any holding that would require specific evidence by the government of, precise electoral certificates or that kind of thing. Here, the point of it would be that those who came to the Capitol and engaged in this criminal conduct to displace Congress violently from where it had to be to count those votes acted with an intent to impair Congress's ability to consider that evidence.
General, the district court and the dissent below had a different variation on the statute and how to read it. You were starting to explain that to the chief. Could you do it if we accepted the district court's view? I presume that you could do it if we accepted the dissent below, correct?
Yes.
Yeah,
so
your whole response to Justice Ketanji, to Justice Jackson, to Justice Jackson, is that it assumes the dissent's view.
I thought that Justice Jackson was potentially proposing even a broader view, including focusing on the availability part and making clear that when the whole point is to prevent the proceeding, including the consideration of evidence in the proceeding from happening, that could qualify. Okay. I think it becomes potentially harder on the Judge Katz's view and especially harder on the Judge Nichols' view. And that's precisely because Judge Nichols seemed to think that to prove obstruction, it had to be limited to taking action with respect to the documents themselves, and that would be a difficult standard for us to satisfy.
You read our discussion on corruptly yesterday. It's clear. You've endorsed the Robertson view. Could you tell me what you feel about the Walker view, and Judge Walker being part of the majority below? I assume you know that. But
yes. So Judge Walker articulated an idea that corruptly has to turn exclusively on the government being able to show that the defendant sought to secure an unlawful advantage for himself or someone else. We certainly agree that that's one way for the government to prove corrupt intent. It's a way that has traditionally been deployed in the tax context because the very theory of the case is that the defendant is violating the tax laws or taking efforts to secure an unlawful advantage under the tax laws. But I think that it would be incorrect for the court to suggest that that's the exclusive mechanism for the government to try to prove corruptly. There are various other ways where we might have evidence of, as we think we do here, unlawful means committed with consciousness of wrongdoing, and there's no basis in the common law or in how the term corruptly has long been understood to limit the government's ability to prove it only with that one specific way that Judge Walker pointed to.
The drawer in this case appears to be the fear that reading the government's view of either yesterday's case or today on its plain terms would make it so broad that somehow that presents a problem. I think the judges below struggled with that by saying that gets addressed in the word corruptly and in the nexus requirement, which is the point you made today. But neither of those two issues were resolved below because that wasn't the question below, correct?
That's right. The only issue that the D.C. Circuit resolved was the meaning of the actus reus.
And the only issue between us is whether we read the words, how we read these words.
That's right. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact, as your question touched on, that there are inherent constraints built into the other elements of the statute. The nexus constraint is a really critical one. It is the paradigmatic constraint the court has pointed to ensure that obstruction statutes don't sweep too broadly and scoop up everyday conduct that might be happening out in the world. It has to have that tight connection, the relationship in time, causation, or logic with the official proceeding. And of course, corruptly, we think, sets a very high bar, as evidenced by the fact, as I said to Justice Kagan, it's not like we can even prove it with respect to everyone who was in the riot at the Capitol on January 6th.
Thank you.
General, Are you putting a violence requirement as an overlay on obstruct, influence, impede? And I'm thinking of some of your answers to Justice Alito's hypotheticals. It seemed like you kept emphasizing the aspect of violence that was present on January 6th. So am I understanding you to say there has to be some sort of violence, or no?
No, we don't think that's a requirement under the statute. I think it will clearly be easier for us to satisfy things like the corruptly mens rea when we can point to action here, like assaulting a police officer that is obviously wrongful, unlawful conduct, and everyone knows that that's a crime and you cannot do that. What I was trying to say to Justice Alito is in situations where hypotheticals press on the idea that people are engaging in conduct that maybe they think is constitutionally protected, they might be wrong about that. There might not be a First Amendment right that they think they have, but that can demonstrate that they don't have the requisite consciousness of wrongdoing. That would mean we couldn't prove an obstruction charge.
Thank you, counsel. I'm not quite sure I understood the answer you gave earlier about whether or not you've previously used C2 in this type of case. Have you done that before or not?
We have charged C2 in situations that don't involve evidence impairment, and the litigating position of the department has long been that, as its plain language suggests, it covers myriad ways of obstructing. I'm not aware of any other factual circumstance or event out in the world where we could have proved all of the elements of Section 1512C2 beyond the cases where we've brought those prosecutions. So,
just so I understand, the prosecutions are limited in what way?
They're limited to a requirement that the specific people had in mind an official proceeding. So that would take out the category of hypotheticals where, maybe you're protesting a branch of government, you're outside this court, but you don't have this specific argument in mind. And then we would also need to show an intent to obstruct the proceeding and the nexus to the proceeding, and that can take care of, situations where maybe someone's pulling a fire alarm in a different building, but it's not even where the proceeding happens.
In prior cases, you have applied C2 in a situation, not involving specific documents?
Correct. So things like tipping off someone to the existence of a grand jury investigation, or the identity of an undercover officer, or creating a fake court order that has nothing to do with the evidence in the case, but is just prompting the litigant to dismiss a pending mandamus petition.
And your friend points to an Office of Legal Counsel opinion from 2019 that I haven't looked at it yet, but I will. It says it is consistent with Judge Katz's opinion below.
So that advice that was offered to the Attorney General and never adopted as a formal position of the Department of Justice related to distinct issues that arose out of the special counsel investigation and distinct issues that involved the Office of the Presidency. I don't think that it would be right to suggest that the memo took any firm stand, although it did suggest that maybe 1512C2 should be understood more narrowly, but it certainly didn't represent any formal adoption of that position, and that would have been inconsistent with how the government has always litigated under C2.
What constitutes a formal acceptance of OLC opinions?
I should probably know the answer to that one as a matter of DOJ policy, but what I can tell you is the reason I'm saying that wasn't an official position is because it specifically said there's no need to go down the road of even deciding exactly what 1512C2 covers, because even assuming that it covers the full range of obstructive conduct, the allegations, according to the memo, didn't satisfy the standards there. So it ultimately just punted on the issue and said it's not necessary to engage with that issue further.
Thank you. Justice Thomas?
General, you said, as I understand it, that you have applied C2 in previous cases.
That's right. We've applied it in cases that do not fit the evidence impairment model that petitioner is urging on the court here. And it's not just C2, Justice Thomas, but it's the omnibus clauses of 1503, 1505, 7212. These are statutes that use the exact same verb
those
phrase.
Those are fine, but C2.
Yes.
I'm not clear as to whether or not the specific instances in which you have used C2, because you seem to think that argue that C2 is a standalone provision almost.
We think that it covers the full range of obstructive conduct that's not covered by C1, of course limited by the requirement of an official proceeding.
So if you have applied C2, have there been previous, other than the D.C. Circuit, previous courts of appeals that looked at this?
Yes, and the uniform consensus among the Court of Appeals has been that C2 is not limited by this kind of evidence impairment gloss that petitioner is asking the court to read into the statute. There has been no Court of Appeals that's gone the other way. We cite a string side of them that have recognized, looking at the plain language of this provision, that it sweeps in the myriad forms of obstructive conduct.
So much of your argument seems to hinge on this being being fairly clear.
Established term, verb, phrase, and obstruction law drawn from those other statutes. And as this court has said many times, when Congress takes a phrase like that, it brings the old soil with it. And so Congress would have clearly known that the courts, this court and lower courts, had interpreted the omnibus clause in those other statutes to encompass the full range of obstructive conduct. That's also consistent with all precedent, as I mentioned to you earlier. So I think when you put it all together, there's no real ambiguity here. We clearly have the best reading. And the only other thing, the icing on the cake, if I could, is that if actually what Congress wanted to do is write a statute that focused only on evidence impairment, there was a really clear and obvious way to do it. Congress could have just tacked on a residual clause to C1 that says, or otherwise impairs evidence. It would not have used this oblique reference of otherwise and then used a term that had a well-settled meaning in obstruction law to sweep more broadly to try to convey that type of limited scope. It would just be nonsensical for Congress to draft that way because it would be so readily misunderstood. And in fact, every lower court has understood Congress to have legislated more broadly here.
But that's beginning to sound more like a contextual argument, which you seem to eschew in this case.
Well, no, I think actually that the statutory context and history does bear weight here. And we think that the roots of this language and those other obstruction provisions help fortify or reinforce how the court has always understood the plain language.
Justice Alito?
You argue that there's an exception for conduct that has only a minimal effect on official proceedings. Where does that come from in the text?
That comes from the verb phrase obstruct, influence, or impede, which we think, if you look at dictionary definitions, conveys the type of action that blocks, hinders, makes difficult, persistently interferes with. This is the kind of the verbs themselves we think inherently contain this limitation.
There can't be a minor impediment?
I think as a colloquial matter, yes, maybe, but we think that if you look at what Congress was trying to do as a whole, the lead term here is obstruct. These were various ways of trying to capture the world of obstructive conduct, and I think that adequately conveys the idea that some kind of very minimal, de minimis interference doesn't qualify.
Well, it didn't stop with obstruct. It added impede. But what is the meaning of, how would you define a minimal interference? I suppose a jury would have to be charged on that. In order to prove that the person violated this provision, you must find that the person committed more than caused or intended to cause more than a minimal interference. How do you define it?
So I think, to the extent that this would come up in actual prosecutions, and I'm not aware of any, but if this came up, then I think that it would be the defense theory. It's possible that the court could decide it as a matter of law if, in fact, it was so minimal it doesn't fit within the statutory terms themselves. And I recognize that maybe there could be gray areas about the nature of the obstruction and whether it really satisfies the actus reus. I think that is properly a subject
what about
for
the
the jury.
example I gave you about the 5 protesters in the courtroom? Is that minimal?
I think that sounds minimal to me. I mean, it sounds to me like if it hasn't actually forced any substantial halt to these proceedings, it seems like that wouldn't pick up and track. But, the same issue would arise under 1503, which likewise refers to obstruct, influence, or impede.
You haven't said anything about the surplusage arguments. Let me just ask you a question or two about that. Suppose someone commits conduct that falls squarely within 1512D. The person intentionally harasses another person and therefore dissuades that person from attending or testifying in an official proceeding. So you've got a clear violation of 1512D, punishable by no more than 3 years in prison. But when Congress added 1512C2, which seems to cover exactly that conduct, it said, well, the punishment shouldn't be, you could punish that person for up to 20 years.
There's a key difference between 1512D and 1512C in that D doesn't require the intent to obstruct. And so the effect of the defendant's harassment action is to prevent the testimony or the production of the document, but the government has not read that statute to require an actual intent to obstruct, which I think means there are certain factual scenarios where the government might be able to prove a 1512D offense without satisfying C2. But I do want to be responsive to the broader concern that there's something anomalous about the 20-year penalty here. Let Let me say at the outset that no matter which statute the government charges under, with respect to all of the relevant obstruction statutes here, they would be funneled through the same sentencing guideline. So the charging decision wouldn't make a difference with respect to the sentencing range. And the concern you have with the hypothetical arises equally on petitioner's reading, because so too, everything that would be covered in 1512D falls within his evidence impairment limitation. So I don't think the existence of a statutory max when there's no mandatory minimum should drive intuitions about how to interpret this provision.
Well, I'm not sure that's the correct interpretation of subsection D. How about 1512B, which also has a 20-year penalty, but it seems to be completely subsumed by C2.
I think there is a lot of overlap between B and C. I don't deny that. Again, that would be true on either reading because B is paradigmatic witness tampering. And so even on petitioner's understanding of the statute, there would be equal duplication there. What I would say is there's no actual superfluity because there are ways of violating B that wouldn't fall within our understanding of C2, including acting in a misleading manner towards someone, which wouldn't necessarily satisfy a corrupt intent definition.
Really? You think you could knowingly threaten or corruptly persuade, corruptly mislead someone? I don't understand that argument.
So my recollection is that there are multiple different means of carrying out that offense. Of course, something like threatening or corruptly persuading, that's the kind of duplication I was referring to earlier. But another way you can violate B is through intentionally misleading someone. That wouldn't necessarily require corrupt intent.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, one more question. I was struck by the contrast between your argument here that the court should read in a minimal exception with the argument that you made earlier this term in Muldrow versus the City of St. Louis, where the question was whether an adverse employment action has to be significant or not. And you said, no, it doesn't have to be significant because, quote, the text likewise admits of no distinction between discrimination that results in a significant or insignificant disadvantage. So in Muldrow, you told us, no, don't read in an atextual requirement of significance, but here you seem to be arguing, yes, you've got to read in an atextual requirement of something that's more than minimal.
No, that is not our argument here. We are grounding this in the text. So we're not suggesting that there's a basic de minimis principle that applies throughout all the various legal statutes that are out there. Not anything like that. Instead, we ground this in a particular understanding of what it means to obstruct and what that word conveys.
Thank you.
Justice Sotomayor?
I know the Risch case because I decided it. However, the tip cases, are they in your briefs?
We cite Ahrensfeld. That's the case where a subject of a grand jury investigation was tipped off about the existence of the investigation, but there was no, kind of material impact or clear evidence of impairment of the evidence or availability of testimony or physical documents. And there are a number of cases in that line, including, I don't think we specifically cited, but it includes the disclosing the identity of an undercover officer.
Where do I find those?
We would be happy to supply additional citations if you're looking for them. I believe that the D.C. Circuit decision as well cited a range of C2 cases and made clear that they didn't cover evidence impairment.
Thank you.
Justice Kagan?
Mr. Green referred a few times to 1519 and basically said, well, that's supposed to be the catch-all provision, the omnibus provision. Why are you asking 1512 to do the same thing that 1519 is supposed to do? So that's one question I have for you. And the other question I have is just, you've referred a number of times to other omnibus provisions, 1503, 1505. What's the tax one?
7212, 26 U.S.C. 7212.
If we go down Mr. Green's road in terms of importing other limits from other places in the statute, are any of those likely to be challenged in the same kind of way, or are they written sufficiently differently so that we wouldn't have to worry about that?
So let me take the questions in order. With respect to petitioner's reliance on 1519 as the catch-all here, I understood the court's decision in Yates to say precisely the opposite. In fact, Yates drew a direct comparison between 1519 on the one hand, which it said was a more narrow obstruction provision based on some of the contextual clues there, and 1512c1 on the other hand, which has the phrase record, document, or other object, and said, well, that's the broad obstruction provision. That's the one that's intended to be codified in this broader prohibition that's aimed at official proceedings, and that C1 language is actually quite broader and would scoop up the entire world of physical objects, in contrast to the narrowing interpretation the court accepted in Yates. So I don't think the idea that 1519 was the broad catch-all can in any way be squared with what that statute says or how this court interpreted it in Yates. And instead, I think that the example to draw from Yates, or the lesson to learn from it, is that this court recognized that Congress was plugging the specific hole in the Enron scandal, and it did so with overlapping provisions, 1512c1 and 1519, but it was 1512 that the court pointed to as the place where you would sensibly locate this broader provision that aims at the full range of obstructive acts to catch the known unknowns. With respect to the question, I'm sorry, now I'm forgetting the second question, about the other statutes and whether they would be endangered. I would be concerned about that. I'm sure defendants would try to make arguments. The language, the verb phrase is exactly the same, or in different order sometimes, but it's obstructs, influences, or impedes. And so the relevant verbs in the actus reus would be similar. There are different direct objects there. For example, in 1503, it's the due administration of justice. In 1505, it's the administration of the power of Congress's inquiry and investigation. But it's not clear to me whether defendants might seek to try to now artificially limit those clauses beyond their plain terms, even though these kinds of provisions have been in the obstruction law. I think it traces all the way back to 1830, and they've never been understood to have that kind of narrow limitation to evidence impairment or anything else.
Thank you. Mr. Gorsuch, Justice Kavanaugh?
I think the key word in that is otherwise, and trying to figure out what that means under our established principles of statutory interpretation. It would seem to trigger justum generis under the Begay precedent, and you've used the phrase a few times, catch-all provision, as does your brief, and Scalia Garner book describes justum generis as how you interpret catch-all provisions. Does justum generis apply here or not?
No, we don't think it can sensibly apply here. So the court has said many times that otherwise is a natural way for Congress to create a broad catch-all category. And I certainly don't dispute that there can be situations where you have a parallel list of nouns or a parallel list of verbs where the court might further think that justum generis principles apply. But that's just not how 1512C is structured. It has, as I've mentioned, its own complex internal structure. You've got the mens rea requirement that's unique to C1, and Congress did not transplant that into C2. That triggers the other canon that when Congress uses disparate language in two adjacent provisions, usually it means something by that. So I think that this just isn't the kind of situation where the court could sensibly apply justum generis. And the other thing I would say is that, if the court goes down the road of trying to glean some kind of requirement from C1, the other reason the canon is inapplicable here is that it's not evident on its face what the common attribute would be. And that relates to the Nichols-Katz's dispute.
As you know, that's true in almost every justum generis case, and the treatise explains that as well, which is it's hard sometimes to figure out what the common link among the words in the phrase is. So I don't think that point I don't think distinguishes this case from other justum generis cases, but you can respond to that.
But I do think that a plain speaker of English would recognize that usually the common link or the connective tissue is the language that follows the word otherwise. That's the congressionally approved similarity. That's what C1 and C2 have in common. They both relate to obstructing an official proceeding. And, I recognize that petitioner has invoked Begay. Your question touched on it. But the statute in Begay, which we think is not the model of statutory interpretation to follow here, the statute itself was relevantly different. It had a list of nouns, and so it was the kind of statute where potentially a justum generis could apply.
What about the contextual points, a couple of them that I think have come up, but I just want to make sure you have a chance to respond, that it would be odd to have such a broad provision tucked in and connected by the word otherwise.
I don't think that the placement in the statute is odd at all for a couple of different reasons. One is the point I was trying to make to Justice Kagan about this court's own recognition that 1512 is one of the big obstruction statutes. This is the statute that is aimed generally at official proceedings. It's not more discreet, and there are other provisions like 1519 and some of the ones that come right before it that are more narrowly confined and are intended to reflect discrete circumstances. That doesn't describe 1512 at all. So when Congress was trying to broadly prohibit obstruction of official proceedings, 1512 was exactly the right place to go. Then petitioner says, well, Congress buried it in the middle of the statute. But I think it's actually quite explicable when you look at how the other provisions are structured. 1512D, which I was discussing with Justice Alito, has a much more minimal penalty and doesn't require the intent to obstruct. So it made sense to put 1512C before it, but also after 1512A, which is the most serious obstruction, like killing a witness, punishable by 30 years or up to life.
Last question. There's 6 other counts in the indictment here, which include civil disorder, physical contact with the victim, assault, entering and remaining in a restricted building, disorderly and disruptive conduct, disorderly conduct in the Capitol building. And why aren't those 6 counts good enough, just from the Justice Department's perspective, given that they don't have any of the hurdles?
Because those counts don't fully reflect the culpability of petitioner's conduct on January 6th. Those counts do not require that petitioner have acted corruptly to obstruct an official proceeding. And obviously, petitioner committed other crimes that we've charged and that we're seeking to hold him accountable for. But one of the distinct strands of harm, one of the root problems with petitioner's conduct is that he knew about that proceeding. He had said in advance of January 6th that he was prepared to storm the Capitol, prepared to use violence. He wanted to intimidate Congress. He said they can't vote if they can't breathe. And then he went to the Capitol on January 6th with that intent in mind and took action, including assaulting a law enforcement officer that did impede the ability of the officers to regain control of the Capitol and let Congress finish its work in that session. And I think it is entirely appropriate for the government to seek to hold petitioner accountable for that conduct with that intent.
And are the sentences, the sentence available is longer for this count than for any of the other counts or all of them together?
The statutory maximum is higher, but after a recent decision in the D.C. Circuit, which held that a particular sentencing enhancement doesn't apply, that was the Brock case, I believe the sentencing range, the guidelines range for the assault count would actually be a higher guidelines range. And just to give you a sense, for a typical January 6th defendant, someone who doesn't have a prior criminal history and who committed violent conduct at the Capitol, accepting responsibility, I think the average guidelines range or the range that would yield is 10 to 16 months of imprisonment. For someone who didn't commit violence, it would be 6 to 12 months of imprisonment. We've looked at the average sentences here. There are about 50 that have gone to sentencing, conviction and sentencing on just a 1512C2 as the only felony, so I think that's the best way to gauge it. This was when the sentencing enhancement did apply, so the ranges were higher. The average sentence among the approximately 50 people is 26 months of imprisonment, and the median has been 24 months. So there's no reasonable argument to be made that the statutory maximum here is driving anything with respect to sentencing.
Thank you.
Justice Barrett?
General, I want to ask a clarifying question about the distinction in the government's charging decisions between C1 and C2. Actually, let me make that stronger, not charging decisions, like what you could charge under the statute. So as you pointed out to Justice Kavanaugh just now, C1 has this additional mens rea requirement, but, there is overlap. If you read otherwise obstructs, influences, etc., broadly, it would encompass, frankly, even in the other reading, it would encompass things like alters, destroys, mutilates, etc. But you wouldn't have to prove the extra mens rea. I thought I heard you say, and I just want to clarify to Justice Jackson earlier in the argument, that the government could not charge an alteration, mutilation, concealing a document or physical object under C2. Am I?
That's correct. We usually charge the specific paragraph, and so if the conduct fits within C1, we would charge it under C1, and that would be the proper place to locate the charge.
And is that charging, is that prosecutorial discretion, or do you think the statute would permit you to charge it under C2, thereby escaping the specific intent requirement?
Well, let me say that there is a specific intent requirement under C2, so there's no distinction between them in that regard. Right, it's the intent to obstruct the official proceeding. So you're right that we wouldn't have to prove intent to, mutilate a document or something, but we would still have to show the intent to obstruct the proceeding. This is pressing on, honestly, what's a difficult question about means versus elements, and I think the best reading of the statute is that these are different elements because they have these different actus rei, they have the different mens rea the mens rea requirement that's specific to C1. They each independently prohibit attempts, but it's a hard question ultimately. And if we charged under the wrong paragraph accidentally, I think we could usually say that was harmless error or else recharge under the correct paragraph.
Okay, let me ask you a question that kind of gets at some of the same points that Justice Alito's questions were getting at. So what if on January 6th, the Capitol itself had not been breached, the protest is going on outside the Capitol, stop the steal, police are, in megaphones saying disperse, disperse, they're too close to the Capitol, their goal is to impede, stop the proceeding, stop the counting of votes. Does that violate the statute in your view under this impede language?
So I think that one relevant question would be whether we could satisfy the nexus requirement and show that actually the natural and probable effect of that conduct would be to have some effect on what's going on in the Capitol and in the mind run.
You can.
Yes. So if you're assuming that the same thing happened where Congress had to go into recess and couldn't hold the joint session after all because there was such a security risk, I think that probably would be chargeable if we had the intent evidence. Now, as I mentioned before, even with respect to the riot that happened, which was a much more serious breach, we don't have that evidence of intent for everyone. But if we had, for example, organizers where it was absolutely clear that they were the ringleaders who had intended to obstruct and undertook the action with that specific intent and did so knowing it was wrongful, and especially if they went, I'm assuming you're saying they're in the unauthorized area right outside the Capitol, that is unlawful conduct committed with consciousness of wrongdoing if we have the proof of it.
Let's say that I am having a hard time accepting your limiting construction of the verbs obstruct, influence, or impedes to have this extra element. Tell me why I shouldn't be concerned about the breadth of the government's reading, just relying on corruptly and the nexus requirement. Should I be concerned, or could you just embrace it and say, yeah, there might be some as-applied First Amendment challenges or that sort of thing? I mean, can I be comfortable with the breadth if that's what I think?
Yes, you can be. You certainly don't have to agree with us that a de minimis hindrance wouldn't qualify. If you thought that this was unqualified and swept broadly to any kind of hindrance whatsoever, there would still be really important limits in the statute. Obviously, you'd have to have the official proceeding. I think the nexus requirement could be somewhat harder to establish in a circumstance where you might not think that the natural and probable effect of the conduct is going to be to obstruct the proceeding. You'd have to show that the defendant knew that the natural and probable effect would do that. You'd still have to show the corruptly mens rea. And as you mentioned, even if you could show all of that, if it were a circumstance that really did infringe on First Amendment rights, there would always be the backstop of an as-applied constitutional challenge.
Do you think it's plausible that Congress would have written the statute that broadly? I mean, let's say that I think that Justice Alito's example of the protesters in the courtroom, let's say it's corrupt. It impedes the proceeding because we have to go off the bench and things are stopped. Let's say I think that that's covered by the word impedes, and there's the nexus and it's corruptly. Is it plausible to think Congress wrote a statute that would sweep that in?
Yes, I think that there are a lot of legitimate ways to try to voice your dissent if you disagree with what the court is doing, but one of the ways you cannot do it is come into this courtroom, halt the proceedings, force the justices to leave the bench, and do it with the intent and the corrupt mens rea. I think that Congress could think that is a severe intrusion on the functioning of our government and want to protect against that. And again, the 20-year statutory max, of course, is just the max. There's no mandatory minimum. So Congress would have recognized that sentencing courts would use their discretion to tailor the actual sentence to the facts of that specific offense.
Thank you.
Justice Jackson?
So you've emphasized several times that Congress wasn't writing on a blank slate in 1512C, but do you dispute that it was writing against the backdrop of a real-world context? It was in the wake of Enron. There was document destruction, and there was nothing, as far as I can tell, in the enactment history as it was recorded
that suggests that Congress was thinking about obstruction more generally. They had this particular problem, and it was destruction of information that could have otherwise been used in an official proceeding. So can you just give us a little bit more as to why we shouldn't think of this as being a narrower set of circumstances to which this text relates?
Sure. And, I'd start by saying that we, of course, acknowledge that the immediate impetus for adding 1512 to the statute was to close the Enron loophole. It was a glaring loophole in the coverage of the obstruction laws that it wasn't a crime for you personally to destroy the document, and the government had to charge people for instead persuading other people to destroy documents. So that was front of mind for Congress, and Congress wanted to address it. It did address it with C1 and with 1519 separately. But I think the best way to look at what Congress was doing in light of that context is to consider the fact that Congress went further and enacted C2. The broader lesson Congress took away from Enron is that when you set out in advance to try to enumerate all the various ways that official proceedings can be obstructed, things will slip through the cracks. You can't.
Let me just ask you this. Was C2 enacted at the same time as C1?
Yes, it was.
And so why couldn't the broadening relate to other ways in which one might prevent a proceeding from accessing information? So one is documents, records, and other objects, but the known unknown, we don't know, could it be intangible, for example, that C2 is sort of getting at when one gets at physical objects? I guess I'm struggling with leaping from what's happening in one, in the context in which it was actually enacted, to all of obstruction in any form.
So I think the reason why we wouldn't suggest that the context could bear that narrower reading is because of the actual language that Congress used. If it was really just worried about other kinds of record-based, proceeding-based, evidence-based ways of obstructing, then there were easy templates to add that in as a residual clause to C1. There was no need to have this entirely separately numbered prohibition, and especially there was no need to use the well-recognized verb phrase obstructs, influences, or impedes, which was clearly drawn from these other omnibus clauses that sweep more broadly. So I think we think that it's perfectly consistent with the statutory history here to recognize that after Enron, what Congress thought is we don't want novel ways that we aren't thinking about of obstructing a proceeding to not be a crime. We do want to cover the waterfront of obstructive conduct with the backstop of a corruptly mens rea, the limitation to an official proceeding, and so forth. And that's exactly what the words of the statute say.
Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Rebuttal, Mr. Green.
Justice Sotomayor, a defendant who tips off a grand jury witness or tips off the targets of a search warrant is someone who is certainly attempting to impair the integrity or the availability of evidence and would be covered by C2. Just as somebody who creates a document and then that document is shown to counsel and counsel withdraws a mandamus petition has in fact created something that has caused an interference with an official proceeding.
That is too much.
I heard my friend say twice in response to your questions, Justice Gorsuch and Justice Barrett, that C2 would cover peaceful protests as long as she could demonstrate, or the government could demonstrate, that there was the adequate mens rea and a nexus. As to nexus, let's look at what 1512F says. For the purposes of this section, an official proceeding need not be pending or about to be instituted at the time of the offense. There is no nexus. Congress has written it out of the statute right there. If the J6 defendants came on January 5th and did all the kinds of things that they did, maybe one would hope, but if it had happened that way, it would still be a C2 violation. With respect to the corruptly mens rea, Justice Kavanaugh, you asked a question yesterday about the fact that mens rea as a break only works at trial because the government's allegations are taken as true at the motion to dismiss stage. And I think that's exactly right. And that's why it's not a break at all. Or if it's any kind of break, it's a break on a go-kart. It's a wooden stick. What it means is that people like Mr. Fisher have to sit and go to trial and seek to win on a Rule 29 motion because the government hasn't proved their mens rea. The same is true of First Amendment defenses if peaceful protesters are charged with C2. My friend referred to 1503 and 1505, other statutes within, and a number of the justices have pointed out that there are much lower penalties for significant crimes. I would point the court to 1752, which is civil disobedience in a restricted space, which is what Mr. Fisher is charged with. That's a misdemeanor. If you cause substantial bodily injury, that is a 10-year maximum penalty. The government wants to unleash a 20-year maximum penalty on potential peaceful protests. That in and of itself is a bad idea because it's going to chill protected activities. People are going to worry about the kinds of protests they engage in, even if they're peaceful, because the government has this weapon. Finally, I think we haven't touched very much on the breadth of influence because that's one of the words that's used in C12, and that would not only would it be peaceful protest, it could be advocacy, it could be all kinds of lobbying. Those things would be covered as well. We've pointed out in our briefs. And finally, I would say to the court, let's not forget that civil proceedings are covered here. We would submit civil evidentiary proceedings, but civil proceedings. So the government is suggesting that the court should unleash a 20-year maximum obstruction statute on civil litigation in federal courts. I submit and we would submit that is a very serious tool to put in the hands of prosecutors. We urge that the court reverse the D.C. Circuit.
Thank you, counsel. The case is submitted. We will hear argument this morning in Case 22-982, Thornell versus Jones. Mr. Lewis?
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the Court. The Ninth Circuit erred in two critical ways. First, it failed to give any deference to the district court's factual determinations. After hearing the evidence and testimony at the evidentiary hearing, the district court made factual findings as to whether Jones suffered from specific mental conditions and whether those conditions caused him to murder Robert and Tisha Weaver. The Ninth Circuit disregarded those findings, instead substituting its own judgment. My friend defends this error by positing that the district court's only role was to determine whether unpresented mitigation evidence existed. This view eviscerates the traditional role of trial courts in the fact-finding process and will radically change habeas practice, resulting in far more writs undoing state sentences. The Ninth Circuit further erred by failing to meaningfully consider the aggravating evidence or its weight. Strickland does not allow for a sentence to be undone whenever there is some new mitigation that addresses moral culpability. Instead, it requires a reasonable probability that the new mitigation would have to change the sentence in light of the balance between the total mitigation and the aggravating evidence. The Ninth Circuit's approach is contrary to this long-standing test and must be rejected. I urge this court to reverse the Ninth Circuit's judgment, clarify the applicability of clear error review in the Strickland context, and reaffirm the principle that a Strickland prejudice determination requires a reviewing court to reweigh both the total mitigation and the aggravation. I welcome the court's questions.
Can we resolve this simply by saying that de novo review is improper?
I think so, Your Honor. In my friend's responsive brief, he argues that Village Lakeside stands for the proposition that these types of mixed questions addressing constitutional issues are totally de novo. I think there's more room in the Strickland question than that, and specifically in the Strickland prejudice context.
I'm sorry, I don't think I understand your answer. There's no dispute that the court below did not, I'm not talking the federal court, the state court never reached the prejudice prong, correct?
We haven't raised that issue, Your Honor, no.
No, and you're not raising it now?
No, Your Honor.
You're accepting that de novo review with respect to the prejudice prong is correct, at least for purposes of this argument?
De novo review is correct as to the legal determination on the mixed question. Yes, Your
All
Honor.
right. So that, I think, was the question being asked.
Right, so that it's not EDPA deference that you're seeking?
No, Your Honor.
Yes, okay.
Just to clarify, you're saying that there's de novo review in the district court, not de novo review on appeal.
There's de novo review of the district court's. The district court made a prejudice determination, and we haven't raised the question of whether the state court made a prejudice determination, and that judgment was entitled to deference under EDPA. So the district court made a prejudice determination.
Right.
We're asserting that that determination would be reviewed de novo as to the legal question in the Strickland inquiry. But on the factual question of the mixed question, then those factual determinations are entitled to clear error deference under Rule 52 and this court's precedents.
Assuming we accept your argument that the court below didn't weigh the aggravating and mitigating factors, you're asking us for a reversal. Why isn't the vacate and remand appropriate?
I think concepts of finality would dictate that the circuit court has had this case for so long and has spent so much time granting relief on certain issues, reserving other ones, and then having it sent back continuously. It has to end at some point.
That's nice, but we're not fact finders, and we generally don't weigh evidence. There's thousands of pages in this record. I'm still not quite sure why. I understand the basis of your argument. The circuit court did lay forth the fact that it should balance aggravating and mitigating, but I accept that it really didn't do that. It mentioned them but didn't compare them to the mitigating. That's the step you say is missing.
Yes, Your Honor.
And I accept that under Arizona law, the aggravating factors that it failed to weigh are usually given great weight under Arizona law. So, but that's still, I could accept that they didn't weigh them the way they're supposed to. Why are you asking us to do that? I think that that's something that isn't better practice for us to tell the court what it's supposed to do so it gets it right the next time?
Yes, Your Honor, I think so, and I think that's what this court did in Wong v. Belmontes. We've just asked for sort of this extra step because, in our view, the aggravating evidence is so compelling, and the mitigating evidence that was developed in the federal evidentiary hearing is so slight.
Really? I mean, let me just mention one, the head injuries. The original sentencing court knew of 2 or 3 head injuries. In none of them was there proof that the defendant had gone unconscious, as there was in the new evidence that was developed, that when I think he was, if the facts are close to this, if I don't get the details right, please forgive me. But you can correct me if I'm wrong, that at 5 years old, he fell, went unconscious. His mother found him just waking up. In another incident, he fell on his head on a metal roof and taken to the hospital, and there was brain swelling. Don't you think that those facts are sufficiently more serious than what was presented at first and would have shown greater, for a fact finder reasonably to conclude that there was neurological damage from this number of injuries?
So as to the 2 incidents...
And types of injuries.
Yes, Your Honor. I think the evidence concerning when Jones was 5 years old and fell off the swing and had lost consciousness, I believe that was introduced through Dr. Potts' testimony. And I believe that the 11-year-old incident came in through Dr. Potts as well, which was presented to the trial court, along with the evidence of Jones's having been passed out while he was in the military, and sort of the report associated with that. I could be wrong, Your Honor. That was my understanding of the record.
Assume my set of facts. I do know that some of the incidents were introduced at trial by Dr. Possit, but that the more serious ones were found on habeas review and after a more detailed mitigation examination by the experts.
Sure.
The ones showing his unconscious nature and the brain swelling.
And so even assuming that those incidents happened and that information was only introduced post-sentence, the district court's findings about the credibility of Jones's expert witnesses are compelling and entitled to deference because the head injury alone isn't really dispositive of anything. It just says that Jones fell and hit his head and he lost consciousness and there may have been some swelling in these things. But without the underlying expert opinions to explain why that affected Jones and why that affected his conduct at the time of the crimes, it's not as compelling of mitigation as it would be otherwise.
Can I say something?
Sure.
If a judge, a district court were to say, I will only consider mitigating evidence if it is confirmed by 1,000 scientists beyond a reasonable doubt.
I don't think
and then says, I'm not going to consider it.
Sure.
Even if you credit it, you could come back and say the aggravators still outweigh the mitigators, correct?
Correct, Judge.
So, but if a judge were to make that error, would that be a legal error?
I think so, because it wouldn't reflect the actual sentencing process where the sentencer has to have the ability to consider any relevant mitigating evidence.
All right, so I read the circuit court here as saying that's what the district court did or how it erred, not in ignoring the credibility determinations, etc., but in requiring more proof than the law required. Even under Arizona law, for example, it says you don't need to prove a nexus between the injury and the crime. That's what I have Tenard, T-E-N-N-A-R-D. It's a Arizona case that says you don't need to prove that connection.
Right.
All right? So what I read the Ninth Circuit as saying is the court applied the wrong standard. It might want to give it less weight in the calculus, but that's not what it did. It set a legal standard that said you had to show conclusively that it was present.
I don't think the district court ever purported to say that it was refusing to consider any of this evidence for what it was worth. What we had here...
What it said is Jones did not present, quote, evidence confirming that he suffers from neurological damage caused by head trauma or other factors. I don't see how that's not requiring positive proof.
I think you can split it up. So the district court, when it was faced with conflicting experts on specified diagnoses, said, I have to figure out what's true and what's not true.
Except that's not what we've said in Porter. I mean, I'm sort of picking up on Justice Sotomayor's point here. This court appears to have looked at a similar situation and said, I'm talking about the Porter case, even though the state's experts identified problems with the defendant's expert testimony, it was not reasonable for the court, the district court, to discount entirely the effect that this testimony might have had on the jury and the sentencing judge. So I take that to mean that the responsibility or the role of the district court is to see that there's mitigating evidence there, and in the ultimate weighing, perhaps take into account whether the district court thinks something is more or less credible as it weighs it against the aggravating evidence, but to discount it, to say I'm not going to look at it because you haven't proven or whatever, seems like a problem with the district court's analysis.
Sure. So 2 points about that. If I'm remembering Porter correctly, I think what you had there wasn't the same sort of battle of experts that you had here, because in Porter, state's experts said that they couldn't agree on whether or not it would establish this sort of statutory mitigating circumstance. So I think it's much different when you have experts that are saying categorically, no, Jones does not suffer from cognitive impairment or PTSD, and the district court is forced to decide which account of Jones's mental condition is more accurate.
But I guess what you're asking us here to say that the Court of Appeals erred in recognizing what could be a problem with the district court's analysis, that the Court of Appeals had to defer to these credibility findings under circumstances in which it isn't clear that the district court was supposed to be making this kind of finding. So it feels like one step more you want us to establish here.
Sure, and I would just point out, Your Honor, that the district court still considered the evidence establishing the foundation of all of these specified diagnoses. For instance, the district court considered the impact of Jones's alleged further physical and sexual abuse, but the district court didn't give it very much weight because, as the district court saw it, Jones wasn't a credible reporter for that history.
But I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just especially in light of the trial court's finding that Jones had manufactured the tale about this third-party culpability theory and presented it to the jury.
I mean, isn't it possible that the district court misunderstood its role here? And this doesn't at all go to the question of whether the Court of Appeals might have also misunderstood its role. But just focusing on the district court for a moment, that the district court seemed to think that it was the fact finder in this case, and using a kind of preponderance of the evidence standard, did you show this, did you show that, by 51%. But I don't think that that's what the reasonable probability asks a district court to do. I mean, if you were just to put some artificial numbers on this, suppose that there was enough evidence in mitigation that a court could say something like, I don't know, there's like a 30% chance that this might have affected the way the original sentencer would have decided. Now, 30% chance is not a 51% chance. So if I'm the fact finder, I find you haven't met your burden. But as I understand what we've asked district courts to do in this special Strickland area, it's basically to ask a different kind of question, which does not give you a 51% threshold. It just says, if there's some kind of chance, it might be 30% or it might be 25% or whatever it is, that the district court, that the original sentencer would have done something differently, then I'm supposed to give it back to the original sentencer. So that's where I think it looks to me as though the district court misunderstood its role, and I'm wondering what the answer to that is.
I mean, it's possible, I suppose, Your Honor, that these are trial courts and they're used to settling disputes between conflicting evidence.
Completely. It seems like a very natural thing for the district court to have done. I'm a fact finder. I'm going to say, you're credible, you're not. You've met your 51% burden, you haven't. But this is a special context where we actually have said that that's not the right inquiry.
And, I think the district court was doing things that were still proper even under this view. It's just that those things would happen in the weighing of the prejudice determinant.
Mr. Lewis, have we ever said that it's enough to show there's some kind of chance?
No, Your Honor.
Did the district court ever say that it was applying a preponderance of the evidence standard?
No, Your Honor.
Is it a reasonable understanding of their opinion to think that it was doing fact-finding in the normal way?
I think it was reasonable to assume from the opinion that the district court, when confronted with the conflicting evidence on specified diagnoses, did what it had to do to separate truth from fiction.
Can I ask you about the evidentiary hearing in the first place? I've been trying to figure out, because this case has a long procedural history, and the state isn't challenging this, I understand, but I just want to understand the rationale for it. Why do you think the district court was right to conduct an evidentiary hearing and take in the extra evidence? Because, 2254E2 requires the court to find two things before the new evidence is taken in, and one is the factual predicate that could not have been previously discovered through the exercise of due diligence, and that was what the Ninth Circuit found, and B, the facts underlying the claim would be sufficient to establish by clear and convincing evidence that but for the constitutional error, no reasonable fact finder would have found the applicant guilty of the underlying offense. How did that figure into the conducting of the evidentiary hearing? I mean, maybe it was right. Like I say, the procedural history of this is complicated.
Sure.
Was that correct? And if it wasn't, why isn't the state challenging that?
Well, this was a pre-pinholster evidentiary hearing, so I believe the hearing was granted in 2003, thereabouts, if I'm remembering correctly. I can't give the reasons for why the state didn't more vehemently oppose.
Well, was it proper to have the evidentiary hearing?
I think probably not, Your Honor, but this is, we live in this sort of post-Ramirez world where, we expect people to exhaust their claims and develop their records in state court before those claims can be considered in federal court and without the benefit of any new evidence that wasn't put before the state court. So I think where we are now, we would clearly say this is improper. But at the time when the court granted the hearing in 2003,
Okay.
It's hard to say. I appreciate the question, though.
Can I direct your attention to the second alleged problem with the Court of Appeals? You said that they failed to meaningfully consider the aggregating evidence and its weight. And I'm just trying to understand that argument in light of what they actually did. I see them as listing 3 aggravating factors, as saying the correct standard. I think you agree that the standard is that they say on de novo review we must weigh these factors against the mitigating evidence as developed in the state record that was available but not presented. Is that the right standard?
Yeah.
All right. And then they say reweighing the evidence in aggravation against the totality of the mitigating evidence, they conclude that the mitigating evidence outweighs. But the important part, I think, is that they go on to say this conclusion is supported by the Strickland prejudice analysis conducted by the Supreme Court and our court in similar cases. And then they go through case after case after case, identifying an aggravating factor that is similar to the one in this case and explaining how in that case the court, whether it's this court or another court, found it to be outweighed by similar mitigating evidence. So why is that not a kind of weighing analysis that is proper in this circumstance?
Well, first, there's no ascription by the circuit court of any type of weight to the aggravating circumstances. So what we have here is the district court making the first de novo review of the prejudice question. Wasn't made in state court. We haven't raised that here. The district court's the first one to make it, and the district court ascribes great weight to the aggravating circumstances present here. The Ninth Circuit doesn't rebut that at all, and they don't make any comment on the actual weight of those aggravating circumstances to give some context for how it's actually being weighed.
So you're saying they have to speak direct, because what I see them as doing here is rebutting that in the context of its review of other cases that have talked about similar aggravating factors and have done the weighing. I'm totally with you if they hadn't done that, right? Yeah. Because then we see them not even grappling with the idea of weighing. But it looks like they've gone through and they've said, okay, let's find other cases where similar aggravating factors have been present and mitigating factors were not presented, and what did the court say in those situations, and this one is similar. I guess you're saying that the error here is that they had to have an additional paragraph in which they directly said, and so the district court got it wrong, or?
I think that's possible because that's the last thing we have in the record that actually ascribes any sort of weight to the aggravating circumstances. And if you read Judge Bennett's dissent, you see what we would be looking for in that type of situation. In a lot of the cases that my friend cites, we were dealing with purview of a state court determination. And when you think about Williams v. Taylor, this court is saying that the state court correctly emphasized the strength of the prosecution evidence supporting the future dangerousness to aggravating circumstance. Even a sentence like that shows that the court has assigned some weight to an aggravating circumstance and considered it in some way. We don't have that here. We just have a bare recitation that aggravating circumstances were found, that they existed, but the court focused solely on the weight of the new mitigating evidence, and I think that demonstrates that they didn't consider what Strickland calls for them to consider, which is the balance between the total mitigation and the aggravation.
Counsel, you mentioned, I think, in your opening, if I'm remembering correctly, that one thing we should do today is clarify the legal standards that are applicable. What do you want us to say that we haven't said already?
You know, I do think that this court in Strickland was clear that, you know, there is a factual component to this inquiry, and that the legal questions are whether there was deficient performance and whether there was prejudice from such deficient performance. But I think there's a little room within those legal determinations for factual findings that are entitled to deference. These prejudice determinations are so fact-intensive because your reviewing courts are required to engage with the circumstances of the crime, with life history details, and to figure out how those would be weighed and resolve the issue. So I think when the district court makes those types of weighing determinations with the benefit of seeing live testimony, the demeanor of how people are presenting their opinions, all these things that trial courts are so well situated to do makes them a good fact finder in this context, even when you're within the legal question of prejudice, for instance, that I think deference is appropriate. And it would be helpful to any courts conducting these type of reviews to understand how far that deference to their factual determination extends.
So to be clear, you would say that underlying facts like the head injury, for example, would be entitled to clear error deference by the Court of Appeals.
I think so, Your Honor.
And that it's only the prejudice weighing, either weighing the mitigating and the prejudicial evidence that gets de novo review in the Court of Appeals.
I think that's right, because the district court is applying the legal test that this court gave in Strickland for finding prejudice, and so that would be naturally subject to de novo review.
And so just to connect it back to some of the questions Justice Kagan was asking you, you're saying that for the underlying fact, like for example the head injury, a preponderance standard would apply, but that the Strickland standard, the special Strickland standard, applies at the weighing only?
I'm not sure. I don't think we've really briefed what burden would apply to establish these facts. You know, in a traditional mitigating in a penalty phase hearing in a trial court, in Arizona at least, capital defendants are required to prove their evidence by a preponderance of the evidence. But even if it's under a reasonable probability standard, that is whether there's a reasonable probability that a sentencer would find it compelling in the weighing, that's still a burden that they have to meet, and the district court or trial court's determination in that regard would be entitled to deference.
Mr. Lewis, I agree with you entirely that the circuit court is supposed to should treat the district court's evaluation of these kinds of claims with great care. The district court is the one that sat there through all the evidence. The district court presumably knows the record a lot better than the circuit court does. So I'm full square with you on that. But when you start talking about sort of clear error review of fact-finding, that's when I see a real switch in the way we in the way we understand the Strickland inquiry. Because that would suggest to district courts that their job in this proceeding, may I finish?
Yes, sure.
Is to say, was there a head injury, was there not a head injury? Did he have PTSD, did he not have PTSD? Which is, of course, the usual thing that district courts do, but not the usual thing that we've asked them to do in this context.
I mean, I see the point, Your Honor. I just think that there is room for these types of factual determinations, and because the district court is so well situated to make those determinations, that they should be entitled to deference.
Justice Thomas? Justice Alito?
Mr. Lewis, the question of prejudice is a mixed question, right?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. What's the legal component and what is the factual component?
The legal component is whether there's a reasonable probability that, in consideration of the total mitigation and the aggravating evidence, the sentence would have changed.
You think that whether there's a reasonable probability is a question of law?
I think that's the standard that Strickland formulated.
Probability is a question of law. If I flip a coin, what's the probability that it's going to be heads?
50-50, Your Honor.
Is that a legal question?
No, Your Honor.
Is that a factual question?
Yes, Your Honor.
Somebody jumps out of a third-story window. What is the probability that the person is going to die? Is that a factual question?
Perhaps an actuary and a doctor could formulate some probability to guess.
Give me a situation in which probability is anything other than a factual question.
Right, Your Honor.
Then why are you saying that whether there's a reasonable probability is a legal question? There's a legal part of the prejudice inquiry. It's what is the standard? The standard is reasonable probability. If the district court says, no, it's any minor probability, that's wrong. If the district court says it's beyond a reasonable doubt, that's wrong. But that's the legal part. Then the factual part is applying that to the facts of the case. Was there a reasonable probability? You with me so far?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judge.
Justice Sotomayor?
The district court never said that this defendant never experienced those head injuries. He just said he didn't believe that they were tied to the crime, correct?
I think in some regards, because you had all these other injuries that were being reported in the...
But he never said he disbelieved the reporting of the mother that the defendant had at 5 years old.
Not as to the 5-year-old incident.
And not to any of it. All right. Justice Barrett asked you about 2254E2. I think Cullen itself said that when there's de novo review of an issue the state court presented to the state court that it never reached, that a fact-finding was appropriate in habeas. That might be the reason why the state didn't fight the
Perhaps, Your Honor. I didn't come prepared to answer those questions. I apologize.
But Cullen, I will say Cullen at 185 says that.
Thank you, Your Honor.
As you know, I dissented there, so I know that decision well.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Justice Kagan. Justice Gorsuch?
I just want to see if I understand where the ball has bounced this morning.
Sure, Your Honor.
So one could view reasonable probability as your colloquy with Justice Alito suggested as a factual inquiry, right?
Sure, Your Honor.
Or one could, I think, as you've suggested otherwise in response to other questions, suggest that it has both a factual and a legal component. And in order to assess whether a jury or a judge at sentencing would have changed its mind, you first need to know what the facts are.
Yes, Your Honor.
That would be relevant to that inquiry. Call it legal, call it factual, and somebody has to decide what those facts are.
Yes, Your Honor.
Was he hit on the head? How many times? Did it change his cognitive abilities at the time of the crime? Those are all facts that somebody needs to find. Is that your point?
Yes, Your Honor. And that's what we've advocated for in this case through the briefing, is that the district court was faced with diametrically conflicting evidence. Jones has PTSD, Jones does not have PTSD, and the district court had to determine what was true and what was not true before it can move on to the legal question.
Thank you.
Mrs. Jackson?
So I guess where I'm getting a little confused about all of this is that I thought that the standard at issue, as you articulated it in response to Justice Alito, was whether, in consideration of the total mitigating evidence, there's a reasonable probability that the outcome would have been different. Is that right?
So as Strickland terms it, it's a reasonable probability that the sentence would have been different in consideration of the total mitigation weighed against the aggravating circumstance.
Perfect. All right. I agree. I think what Justice Kagan is saying is that that standard takes into account, for the purpose of its application, that all of the mitigating evidence is being presented. That we present this mitigating evidence, we present this aggravating evidence, and would, if all of that had happened, is there a reasonable probability that the outcome would be different? I think the problem that's happening here is that the district court, being a district court, is screening the mitigating evidence up front. There's sort of like another layer being added to this on the front end, where the district court, as you said in response to Justice Gorsuch, is deciding, well, is this really mitigating evidence? Is this a fact? Did this thing happen? And is sort of putting that initial screen on it so that when we get to the Strickland weighing, we have a smaller corpus of mitigating evidence because we've already weeded out the stuff that the district court. I think that's not what's supposed to be happening, actually. I think that whether or not this thing is actually a fact is determined ultimately. That at this level right now, the district court is just deciding whether or not that this basically has to go back to the states, whether the person